Welcome and thank you for all coming. Before we start the discussion this evening, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which Massey College operates. This land is the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. It has also been home to other Indigenous people for the last 15,000 years, including the Huron, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee, and Petun nations. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on these lands. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for all coming to our 12th annual Massey Grand Rounds Symposium titled Tackling the Opioid Crisis from Understanding to Intervention. We are really excited to have everyone here. My name is Arsalan Moqtadei.
And my name is Alexander Kogan.
And we are honored for being this year's co-chairs of Massey Grand Rounds. For those of you who might be new to the Massey College, Massey is an interdisciplinary college made up of junior fellows, which include professional students, graduate students of all disciplines, as well as senior fellows, which include accomplished scholars and eminent members of society. Together, we seek to form a rich and stimulating community. It's truly unique, congenial, and intellectual environment, a bit of which we hope to show you today. Massey Grand Round is a group of Massey College, mentored by Dr. Albie Angel, also a senior fellow, with a focus on engaging in the Massey community in intellectual stimulating discussion and facilitating the exchange of ideas in health, science, and medicine. We do this through monthly meetings as well as our annual MGR Symposium, our premier event where we gather distinguished guest speakers and panelists to discuss timely issues.
Each year we go through a rigorous and exciting process to find a topic that is both current, significant, interdisciplinary, and can engage our broad range of our community at Massey and broadly speaking. Not just those in the healthcare profession and health directly, but everyone. We do this through in-depth discussions and debate throughout the term, bringing together Massey College members to debate and discuss what issues are most significant to them. This year, one issue rose to the top from the very beginning. Opioids have gone from being a cure-all pain miracle drug to a full-blown public health crisis around Canada and North America broadly, affecting families and communities across Canada and North America. In 2016 alone, there were almost 3,000 deaths attributed to opioids, and estimates for 2017 show this number will likely to have grown. So how did this happen? As a group of students, we thought to learn more, and as we did, we found that opioid crisis not to be only a health crisis, but a broad societal issue, complex and multifaceted. There's important history there, important politics and legal issues, as well as principles of addiction, pain management, biology, and public health. All of this is critical to understanding the crisis and seeking ways to intervene. So this afternoon we'll have two goals. First, to seek to better understand the crisis with the help of our distinguished speakers. We'll learn a little bit more about the physiology and pharmacology of opioids, what started the crisis, and the public health response. Second, we'll focus on interventions with an interactive panel designed to tackle the question of what actions will likely help to end the opioid crisis. But before we begin, I'd like to thank a few very important people who made this possible. Firstly, I'd like to thank Massey College in general and the MGR community. I'd also like to thank Principal of Massey College, Principal Hugh Siegel. Thank you so much for coming. As well as the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Dr. Trevor Young, who unfortunately couldn't be here. I also wanted to thank Associate Dean Partnerships of the Faculty of Medicine, Dr. Lynn Wilson, who is here today. We appreciate your presence and contributions. As well as our MGR mentor, Senior Fellow Dr. Albie Angel, under whose tutelage and guidance MGR has been possible for these past 12 years. So before we begin, I'd like to first welcome Dr. Angel to come up and say a few opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Alex and Arslan, for leading off. Give a fine introduction as to the purpose of Massey Grand Rounds and what we like to achieve and how we engage the junior and senior fellowship and how it integrates with the larger community at the university and the community at large, of course. My role today is to give you a brief annual report in Massey College, and that's what I do at Massey Grand Rounds, just to give you a perspective on what we've done and who the people are that we relate to. And the next slide. Yes. I always like to pay homage to the originators, the individuals who took the initial risk, but gathered together some 12 years ago. I thought it'd be a good idea to gather together the health cohort within Massey College, which was a minuscule sum of individuals here, decided to launch a Massey Grand Rounds. These people are all now distinguished physician leaders and practitioners in the community. I'll just go left to right as a reminder. Fiona Menzies, Jay Shaw, Janice Wong, Martin Betts, John Neary, Lori Waters, John Dirks, Andrew House, myself, and Uli German, who took the shot. In those days, of course, we often had a little bit of champagne. You see the champagne glass here? We don't do that anymore for obvious reasons. But in any event, the important point is that these people undertook to initiate something that has prevailed, and we're delighted with that. So, these are congratulations for this. Magic touch. Double. Good. This was the first Massey Grand Rounds. I show it to you just for historic reasons. It looks like an old antique slide, but the point is that the theme at the time was very important, was the nexus of education and industry. At that time, 12 years ago, there was great concern about the pharmaceutical industry having penetrated the academe and actually modifying curriculum by the fact that they were interdigitated in hospitals and at the university and having an undue influence in the thinking and prescribing habits of the academic community. At that time, that was an issue of concern, and students appreciated that. The point I'm bringing out here is the fact that the concern about industry, in this instance, still related to drugs, which are marvels in their own right, and to great service in any event. And last year, we talked about health and environment, and even there, we talked about drugs. Food, drugs, and air, and the environment, and drugs is an environmental influence, positive, but now negative. And of course, this year, we are addressing the issue of opioids. And so it turns out that 3 of the 12 Massey Grand Rounds focus on issues of drugs, and now this is an issue, of course, of great concern, and was the basis of the theme today. So the students in the community really appreciate the importance and significance of the drug, both positive aspects, adding life, quality of life, and years of life, but at the other end, doing great harm. It follows in the track of smoking, alcohol, and narcotics having a devastating effect that we've all heard about with fentanyl and so forth. And so, I also take this opportunity to acknowledge the leadership of Massey Grand Rounds, which has sustained the continuity and interest and significance of Massey Grand Rounds in our own community. And I'd like to point out the MG co-chairs over the years. And you may recognize the names of these people because they've been around and contributed so much. Out of this list, I want to draw attention to 2 things. One, of course, Alex Kovan and Arslan Mirgutay, our current co-chairs. But the point you'll notice is that Many of the junior fellows and co-chairs participate for a 2-year cycle, which is critically important for those interested in having programs here to maintain continuity and facilitating the year-to-year transfer and evolution of the program over time. And we're very pleased of our MGR community at Massey Colleges, numbering between 30 and 40 junior fellows who add so much to the experience here. But we can't do anything very much alone. We have a tremendous investment of our senior fellowship and senior colleagues at the University of Toronto. And here's a list of what we call our College of Mentors. These are the people, senior folks like yourself, who come and attend our Massey Grand Rounds events through the year. They come and dine with us, and we have a nice social dinner. And some of the great leadership of the university is listed here, which is kind of interesting to see. And what I've done here is highlight in blue the College of Mentors, guest mentors of this year: Jackie James, John Flores, Reinhard Reichmeyer. I also note last year, Michael Bliss last May died, a senior iconic figure at the university and in the country. So these people sustain us, and what's wonderful about them is that they have a great time when they engage with the junior fellowship. This is the program you have in front of you. I won't go through the detail. Can't focus a bit, but is there a focus here? I wanted to point out the listed junior fellows here that contribute so much in organizing, in particular Arsalan and Alex, who've been such great supporters and organizers, but also point out that the artwork that we see in all our posters are also generated by the junior fellows, and this year's artist is Arsalan, great poppy and nerve cell intertwined with this Africaduceus. And if you look at the heart of the nerve cell, you'll see the North American continent. So there's subtleties in here, so if you look at it very carefully, there's something to it. So we thank you, Arsalan, for last year's artwork and this year's artwork. Well done.
Pleasure.
Today's program. And finally, nothing can be done in the absence of support, sponsorship, and interest of the bigger organizations within our midst. And MGR is very grateful, of course, to Massey College. In the past and currently with UC, who've been very generous in helping us, promoting us, and adding to a feature we'll discuss in a minute, the establishment of a Massey lectureship, the generous lectureship, which we'll address in a moment. But also, I'd like to acknowledge the Faculty of Medicine and the Department of Medicine, who've added substantially to our capacity to do things, because they actually contribute Canadian dollars, which is great, very, very useful, very helpful over the years, and continuing commitments. Also, the Department of Medicine at the University of Toronto. The Friends of CIHR is a major sponsor here, because it's through this organization that my time is available, and our office supports this in support of kind. But also, Christina Castelvian has been an administrator to the program for all the years. Thank you very much, Christina, for all that. And before we get into the next thing, perhaps I'd like to invite Principal Siegel to come up and say a few words of welcome, and then we'll introduce the generous lectureship.
Abhi, thank you, and thank you for your continuing service and leadership here at the college. And I want to thank all the junior fellows who've been involved in organizing today's work. My first experience with MGR was actually before I started to work here. I was elected in December of 2013, and I came to the one that took place in the spring of 2014 before I actually showed up for my first day of work. And I was blown away by the entire idea that an issue would be looked at by physicians, by medical researchers, by distinguished educators in healthcare, but not only from a healthcare perspective, from a broader interdisciplinary perspective. And every single event that I've had the privilege of seeing over the last 5 years has made the case time and time again that we have to work on a broad interdisciplinary basis to find solutions to some of the challenges that are so fundamental in our society. And if you think about it, that goes right to the spirit of Massey College, that people of different academic disciplines and backgrounds and experiences and from different parts of the world, different cultures, races, languages, work together, learn from each other, and benefit from that diversity both in terms of their study and in terms of the lives they build for themselves and the networks which become so fundamental to how they go forward to serve our society and our world. And I just want to pay tribute to this, the 12th year of MGR, and to Ob, who is not only a mentor to the people who work at MGR, but he's been a mentor to me. And the truth of the matter is, this being Massey, no two members of Massey College ever agree on everything. In fact, if we didn't disagree from time to time, we would think we're in the wrong place. But we've never been disagreeable. And we've always found a way to work together in the interest of this great college, and MGR is a great example of how that comes together. And I know Avi has a very important announcement to make, for which he has the entire support of this college. Avi.
Thank you. Well, we're very pleased to announce the establishment of the Massey College Janet Rosent Lectureship. Now, Janet Rosent is almost an iconic figure in Canadian biomedicine, developmental biology, and we're absolutely delighted that she would lend her name, but also be interested in support of an initiative at the college called the Janet Rosent Lectureship, linked to Massey Grand Rounds. And I'd like to thank Principal Siegel for endorsing and supporting this, and acknowledge Janet Rosent for participating in this, because what we are now able to do is add a new feature to Massey Grand Rounds by bringing in international talent, mid-career individuals who bring a special quality, special prestige to the event and add to the intellectual diversity of events here on an annual basis. So we're delighted and absolutely pleased to announce this formally today, and a media release will go out accordingly. Now, the whole idea, of course, is to bring this talent here and have them visit for a day, spend time with the junior fellows and with the senior fellows and academics in the community, depending on their subspecialty, and from time to time, in fact, build a program around these individuals because they have very special talent. To guide us in this program, we've identified a advisory group made up of peers to Janet, who will help identify and support this program. I'll just mention their names. Myself, John Dick, Jillian Hawker, Prabhat Jha, Steve Scherer, Barbara Sherwood-Lawler, who's here, head of the science program, hi Barb, and Kathy Whiteside, Dean Emeritus. And as well on the committee, ex officio will be Hugh and Janet herself, and the MGR co-chairs who will give youth, bring down the average age of this group. The point being that we'll be guided by the very best from within to identify people of great stature. But as a Massey community, you'll all be welcome to bring forward ideas and thoughts, and we hope that the first Janet Rosent lecture will be identified for 2019 MGR. So put your thinking caps on as to who you might like to invite, and pass the names on, and this committee will help adjudicate the very best. And like everything else, we'll have a panel of good people to choose from. Of course, it'll have independent prestige. There'll be a prize award to the individual, to the recipient, and they'd be deemed the Janet Rosent lecture for the year at Massey College, coupled to MGR. Well, that's the special announcement, and I think we should get on with the program. And so I'll sit down.
Okay, so we're going to start with the keynote addresses. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Irfan Dalla, Assistant Professor of the Department of Medicine and IHBME, University of Toronto. He's going to be giving us a presentation on the physiology and pharmacology of opiates and why they are so addictive. Dr. Dalla.
Actually, I don't know. Do I really need this?
Yes. Thanks, Avi, for inviting me, and thanks, Alex and Arsalan as well, and for the organization. Hands up if you've ever had a beer or a glass of wine or champagne.
Like today?
Oh, honestly, come on, hands up. All right, most of us. Okay. Hands up if you have ever smoked a cigarette or a cigar. Looking at you, Hugh. So we've got a fair number of lifelong non-smokers in the room. I'm happy about that. I would guess there are some people who've smoked at least one cigarette who didn't put up their hands. Hands up if you've ever consumed marijuana. Actually more than cigarettes, wow. Hands up if you have ever been prescribed Tylenol number 3, or Percocet, or morphine, or Dilaudid, or fentanyl, or any other opioid. So most of us. No surprise. Okay, hands up if you have ever used heroin. So one hand, 2 hands. So first of all, thank you for your honesty. I expected nobody would put up their hands. But of course, in a room this size, it's no surprise that there are some people who have used heroin. But no surprise, a lot fewer of us have used heroin than any of the other substances I mentioned. So why not? Let's make this a little interactive.
It's not legal.
So I heard it's not legal. Neither is marijuana yet.
No, but the other opiates are.
The other opioids are, good.
Yeah.
Any other? Yeah, in the back.
You have no idea what you're really buying.
No idea what you're really buying. True. Any other reasons why people don't use heroin?
Sheltered life.
Sheltered life. Yeah. It's what? It's lethal. Yeah. Other reasons? Yeah?
Afraid of addiction?
Yeah, afraid of addiction. So, in fact, probably the number one reason why most of us have never used heroin, even though most of us have used marijuana, is that we are afraid of addiction. People fear heroin. Now let me show you something. So this is the molecular structure of morphine. I think I saw it buried in Arsalan's graphic in there. We humans have been cultivating the opium poppy, also on Arsalan's graphic, for nearly 6,000 years, because this molecule is inside the sap in that poppy, and we love the effect that this molecule produces on us when it binds to the opioid receptor in our brain. Relieves pain. For some people it produces a sense of happiness, euphoria. Can bring on sleep. That's one of the reasons why people sometimes use morphine or opium in some places. But we like the effect that this molecule has on us through its interaction with the opioid receptor in our brain. Now let me show you something else. So this is the molecular structure of heroin. You don't need some of you might be graduate students in chemistry, but you don't need a graduate degree in chemistry to see that these two molecules are very, very similar. I'm not a chemist, but I believe that basically there's 2 hydroxyl groups on the left in the morphine molecule, and they've been replaced in the heroin molecule with 2 acetyl groups, that MECOO, the ME is for methyl, and hence the chemical name for heroin, which is diacetylmorphine. So somebody made the point about the purity of heroin, and that's a very good point. We don't know what we are getting if we purchase heroin on the streets. But heroin can be made in a pharmaceutical grade heroin, and it can be very pure. And in fact, heroin was first synthesized by a chemist in England in a medical school in the late 19th century. That chemist set it aside. It was independently synthesized about 23 years later by a chemist who worked for Bayer, the drug company, in the early 20th century. And heroin was marketed by Bayer for more than a decade, I think. And it was initially marketed as a non-addictive substitute for morphine. Bayer's view was people were, obviously it had been known for hundreds, thousands of years that people could become addicted to morphine or opium, but what if we could produce a substance that relieved pain the same way morphine relieved pain, bring on sleep potentially the same way morphine brought on sleep, but without the addictive properties, hence let's sell heroin. Obviously it did not turn out that way. We all know that heroin is very addictive, frighteningly addictive, and I would argue that's the reason most of us in the room have not ever tried heroin. I was asked to speak about why opioids. Actually, one thing I wanted to say about this. So these two, I've sort of alluded to this, but let me be just clear about it. Both of these molecules bind to the opioid receptor in the brain, as does any other prescription opioid. And the opioid receptor in the brain cannot really distinguish between the different opioids that are binding to it. There's some subtleties to that. I'm looking at Mel because that's not entirely 100% accurate. And if you talk to people who use drugs, in fact, they will say that they can perceive differences between different opioids. And most people who use drugs can perceive differences between morphine and heroin. Actually, most people who use heroin cannot perceive differences or cannot be confident that they perceive a difference between another prescription opioid, hydromorphone, and heroin. There have been double-blind, randomized controlled trials looking at people who use heroin and seeing whether they can use hydromorphone instead. And in those studies where the people who use drugs have not been told which substance they're on, none of the people assigned to the hydromorphone group in those trials, or in one particular trial, have been confident that they have been getting, or confident that they have not been getting heroin. So these two drugs and other prescription opioids, they all bind to the same receptor in the brain. So I was asked to talk a little bit about why opioids are addictive. And I thought I could get up here and talk about dopamine, opioid receptors, oxytocin, the molecular pharmacology. I don't actually think that will help you understand why opioids are addictive. My own hunch actually is that you can't truly understand why opioids are addictive unless you have been addicted or are addicted to an opioid yourself. That's my hunch. I just don't believe that it's possible to truly understand. And I've talked to a lot of people who have suffered from an addiction themselves, as I'm sure many people in the room have. So I would never wish an addiction upon anyone, particularly one to opioids, and so hopefully you will never understand opioid addiction the way somebody who has been addicted to an opioid understands it. I would argue that the next best thing is to listen to people who have been addicted to opioids. And I think that you have to listen actually to a lot, because every person's story is different, and the reasons why one person becomes addicted may be different from the reasons why another person becomes addicted. And the more you listen, the more you will start to hear trends and stories. And since I don't believe we have somebody today who's going to tell us themselves about what it is like to suffer from an opioid addiction, I thought I would show you a very short video, if the technology works. If it does not work, I will tell you about the video. Oh, thanks. Let's see if this works.
Gary Tuckman talked with some addicts walking the streets. We want to warn you, this may be tough to watch, but we think it's important to see how the opioid epidemic is unfolding in the U.S. Here's Gary's report.
To most people, this is a neighborhood south of downtown Boston. To others, it's a living hell.
I'm a junkie. I've been shooting heroin for 16 years. I'm homeless. I live on the sidewalk. And this is my life.
You know, I didn't grow up thinking I was going to be a heroin addict. Like, this isn't exactly what I want to be. Like,
What are your hopes and dreams?
To get sober, to have a family. I, at one point, thought I was going to, and I lost the love of my life. We both overdosed. When I woke up, he was dead.
Billy is 31 years old. He has a 5-year-old son. He wants to be a tattoo artist someday. But even while we talked, he was looking for a vein.
Is it possible for you to stop shooting the heroin while we talk?
If I had gotten it in me, it would be, but
that's what I'm wondering, like you feel such a strong urge that you can't stop while we talk?
yeah. There's nothing that would stop me. And that's how bad it gets.
Megan also lives on the streets and the sidewalks.
You're about to reach your 30th birthday. And how long have you been addicted to heroin?
Since 19.
And how did you start the first time?
It was pills. Then pills became expensive, hard to get, and heroin was just extremely easy to get and a lot cheaper.
Like Megan, the gateway to heroin for Billy was also pain pills. He was 13 years old when he started.
I was already using prescription pills. I liked the way it felt. I found out heroin was cheaper than the pills, and it was more intense, so I began sniffing heroin. And then I found out shooting it was the next step from there, and I would save money and went right to shooting. The first time I shot it, I fell in love with it. It was like, the only way I can explain it is like I met God.
Billy and Megan are joined in their opioid devotion with scores of...
So there are 3 things I would like to highlight from that video. So one is the phenomenon of withdrawal. So Billy, the reason why Billy needed to inject even while he was speaking to the recorder is almost certainly that he was experiencing withdrawal. So this phenomenon, an intense craving for opioids that happens when the opioids start to kind of come off the opioid receptor in the brain. And it's hard to really, I don't think, again, you can really understand withdrawal probably unless you've been through it yourself. Andrew Sullivan, the writer, described withdrawal in a very recent article he wrote for New York Magazine, available online. Let me just read to you a paragraph. The terrifyingly dark side of the poppy reveals itself the moment one tries to break free. The withdrawal from opioids is unlike any other. The waking nightmares, hideous stomach cramps, fever, and psychic agony last for weeks until the body chemically cleanses itself, end quote. And actually, in my experience, for some patients, that psychic agony never really fully goes away. And withdrawal is one of the main reasons why, as others will tell you later today, the mainstay of treatment, our first-line treatment for people who suffer from an opioid addiction is actually another opioid, right? If you take people like Billy or Megan and you can provide them with a stable supply of a pure opioid, whether it's buprenorphine, usually buprenorphine or methadone, but it can be other opioids as well, they will be able, or much more likely at least, to stabilize other aspects of their life as well. And so I did want to emphasize that notion of withdrawal. It's a relatively unique feature of the pharmacology of opioids. The second thing I wanted to highlight in that video, and it doesn't really relate to the question of, or I don't think it relates to the question of why opioids are addictive per se, but it's very important in the grand scheme of the opioid crisis, is the unique lethality of opioids, so how lethal they are. So you heard Megan say she overdosed with the love of her life. She woke up, he didn't, right? Many drugs can cause fatal intoxication. It is possible to consume enough alcohol at one sitting to die from an alcohol poisoning. It is, however, very, very rare. The singer Amy Winehouse died that way, but very few people have died. I should say very few in the grand scheme of things, but it is very rare. Alcohol is much more likely to kill over decades. Cocaine can cause a fatal overdose, usually mediated through high blood pressure or heart rhythm disturbance, but again, quite rare. The difference between the dose of an opioid that is required to bring on euphoria and the dose that is fatal is small. And that's why problems related to purity, fentanyl contamination become so important. And the way this happens is opioids bring on sleep. You heard Megan talk about that.
Tens of thousands of people. And the details of what was happening, both in advertisements, in visits from pharmaceutical representatives who were detailing doctors, it's all publicly available now. They pled guilty in 2007. So it's been available, the answer's been available to us for a long time, that we had an increase in opioid prescribing. We had the increase in deaths. There was lots of money being made off of opioids, and we now have clear evidence that they were being mismarketed as having a lower abuse potential. And that's why, and the story is that the company did some market research and they realized that doctors were not prescribing opioids in many situations because they were fearful of the effects of addiction and misuse. And so the company designed a marketing campaign that would directly counter those concerns. And they were successful. They did that, and the opioid prescribing went up. And then people died. So, this is sort of a bracket to why we have the opioid crisis today, a side issue, but it's just worth mentioning that there never was any evidence that using these newer products, the long-acting opioids, would provide better pain management than the old medications. And in general, there was never much evidence to support the use of opioid medications for the most common causes of chronic pain, such as osteoarthritis and lower back pain. That just never happened. And there are recent studies where they have trialed opioids versus other commonly used medications for chronic pain like acetaminophen, and found that there is not any benefit to opioids for the most common causes of chronic non-cancer pain. Just another way of thinking about this is the differences between Canada and the United States in terms of the opioid prescribing and the sort of pain management that is provided in Canada and the United States versus Western European countries like England and France. So we are prescribing opioids at roughly double the rate in Canada and the United States. And so my wife is from England, so don't tell her I said this, but in my view, at a high level, Canada and England are more or less similar countries. Like, we're both high-income countries, speak English, we eat the same sorts of foods, roughly speaking. Again, don't tell my wife that I said that. But if you look at in this study, they calculated the opioid needs per person in the United Kingdom and Canada. And based on the size of the population, the age distribution, the prevalence of conditions that we would treat with opioid medications, and the needs are almost the same per person between Canada and the United Kingdom, but the consumption rates are vastly different, and so it's about 4 times more. Do you think that pain management is 4 times better in Canada than it is in the United Kingdom? It's pretty hard to imagine that, actually. So let me just, I'm going to talk now in the last 5 or 10 minutes before I wrap up here about the opioid crisis. And the opioid crisis, sometimes I see it in quotes. People say the alleged opioid crisis. And so there's some vague language and maybe some ambiguous thinking about the opioid crisis. So I'll try to define it for you. And we could discuss whether or not you agree with the definition. I think the opioid crisis is the excess harms from opioids that we've seen since 1999. And the excess harms would include deaths, and they would include addictions and the negative effects, the harmful effects of addiction. We have always had, as Dr. Dalla was saying, opioid use has been around for centuries. And if you look at statistics from the 1970s, the 1980s, the early 1990s, there were always people who were dying of opioid-related deaths, and there were always people who were addicted to opioids. But we saw a dramatic increase in the rate of opioid use and also the rate of opioid deaths and addictions after the late 1990s. And that's when these medications, the long-acting opioids, were introduced by Purdue Pharma. So when I talk about what caused the opioid crisis, I'm talking about what caused the increase in harms that we saw after around 1999. And I think this is a big part of what caused it. There was an opportunity to make loads and loads of money, like literally tens of billions of dollars off of selling long-acting opioid products like OxyContin, long-acting oxycodone, and that's what happened. So I don't think this is the sort of situation where it's really complex to know what caused the opioid crisis. I do think that the crisis is a good topic for a venue like this, an interdisciplinary venue, because we do need to come together to think about what we're going to do. And that is already happening to some extent, so I think, I'm very critical of some of the things that the federal government has done on this file. One of them is failing even to track opioid deaths. When it was clear, the CDC had reported in the early 2000s that there was an acceleration in the rate of opioid deaths. The federal government did not do that. It took researchers like Dr. Dalla and others to do it. And even after they did it, in Ontario, still the federal government didn't act. And they also failed in a number of ways in terms of approving this medication and allowing it to be marketed aggressively in Canada. But belatedly, the federal government has very publicly accepted that there is an opioid crisis, and they don't put it in quotes. They talk about an opioid crisis in terms of the number of deaths. And they brought together a number of different stakeholders, including groups that represent physicians, drug regulators, border authorities, to think about how to solve the opioid crisis. And I think that sort of thing is needed, and these discussions that we're having are needed. But I also think it would be ridiculous to suggest that we are going to solve the opioid crisis by training more sniffer dogs and putting them in the airport or at border crossings with the United States. It doesn't make any sense. It makes about as much sense as it would make to execute drug dealers, as President Trump recently announced, as a solution to the opioid crisis. It just is not at all related to what caused the opioid crisis, and is not going to it's not going to help realistically. I don't have the chemical structure of morphine here, so this is the equivalent diagram for a simple-minded family doctor like me. So let me just explain this. I think what's happening is so there's a whole pile of money out there to be made, right? And then that money is used to market these opioids. Doctors end up prescribing the opioids. The companies get more money. They put that into advertising. And then there's just the little byproduct of the prescribing is that there are deaths. That's not really a huge concern to the companies. They're more concerned with the left side of the equation. And we know, I'm not going to spend a lot of time belaboring this point, but we know that the pharmaceutical industry puts a lot of money into marketing these medications. They visit doctors, they advertise in journals, they take doctors out to strip clubs or fly them to tennis junkets in sunny places. That sort of thing happens. They hire patient advocacy groups to lobby the government to get their medications approved and publicly funded. All of this has been detailed. So when we think about what's going to end the crisis, I mean, I think really we have to think about what we could actually do and where we're going to, the battles we're going to win and the battles we're going to lose with the pharmaceutical industry. You know, my view is that that focusing to the right of the diagram, these are important things to do. Like obviously, you shouldn't be able to just bring opioids into the country without the authority to do so. And we have to take all of the measures that we can take to prevent deaths. But those things are not going to end the opioid crisis. Providing naloxone, for example, something that I absolutely support, and some of my research was related to improving access to naloxone for people who were released from incarceration or at risk of dying of an overdose in the few days after release. So absolutely, we need to save the lives of people who are already being harmed. But in terms of reducing the death rate to 1999 levels, I think it would be impossible to do that through providing more naloxone. And if you think about the whole stream of events from when someone is first exposed to a substance, becomes addicted, and you want to prevent their death or harm, naloxone is the last thing. So this is after someone is already addicted, has taken an overdose, they're laying on the ground, not breathing. At that point, yes, if we have naloxone, people should have naloxone and we should be giving it to that person. But also what we really should have done is everything possible to have prevented that person from ever being exposed to opioids in the first place. That's what changed after 1999. More people were exposed to opioids. That's what caused the opioid crisis. An increase in the prescribing of opioids that was related to the approval of these long-acting opioid products like OxyContin, and then more people were exposed. There were more pills out there. There were people who had a minor complaint, they went to their doctor, they got a prescription, and then those prescriptions were floating around. The patient took them, other people took them, so there was greater exposure. So that's where we should be targeting our interventions, aimed at ending the opioid crisis that's still burning today as we're sitting in this room. And this graph does not project very well, but so this is some work that one of my students, Harun Ahmad, is doing right now. So the red line here is the number of short-acting products that... Oh, sorry. The red line is it's the number of short-acting products. Oh, right. It's the number of short-acting products that were approved in Canada. So these are short-acting opioid products like morphine or oxycodone products. And then this is the number of long-acting products that were approved. And this is the year 1999, is right here. So we can see by the year 1999, we had 25 opioid products that were short-acting products. That included morphine, oxycodone, hydromorphone, codeine, like fentanyl. Loads of opioid products were available in 1999. And we would have had enough different opioid products available to treat any sort of pain condition that you can think of. And those conditions were being treated with opioids. But in the 1990s, what happened is these long-acting opioids were approved. And there was nothing particularly wrong with them. They could have been used in the same way that the long-acting opioids were used. And the studies suggest that they have more or less exactly the same effects as the long-acting opioids. But there were two things that were different about them. One is they tended to come in higher doses because the idea was that you could take them twice a day. So some of them contain the equivalent of 300 milligrams of morphine if you take them as prescribed in a day, whereas a typical starting dose for a patient on morphine would be less than 20 milligrams. So that was one difference. There were higher doses. But the main difference was that they were promoted aggressively, inappropriately, and we know illegally at least, in the United States. Doctors were told that if you were worried about a patient with an addiction, you could in fact weed out the addicts. That was one of the terms that was used in the marketing campaign. This is in the agreed statement of facts in the United States. You could weed out the addicts by using long-acting opioid products. So that was the problem. And one of the solutions would be to simply just get rid of those long-acting products, which we never needed, which were never proven to be any better, and which were inappropriately marketed in a way that we cannot take back or undo. So one response would be to just get rid of them. So in summary, my suggestion to you for your consideration, and I'm open to discussing this, is that the opioid crisis is very simple. Since 1999, more people have been exposed because of the approval of these long-acting products and their inappropriate marketing. And we should have a target of reducing opioid-related harms to pre-1999 levels, and we can do that by reducing exposures to opioids.
If you have an opportunity, you would answer some questions for discussion.
So, Doctor, am I to conclude, as somebody who knows nothing about the practice of medicine, that when physicians are trained and go through practicum and other exercises to learn the way in which pharmaceuticals may be of value to their patients in various circumstances where different therapies are suggested, they are never given advice about quantum? In other words, someone may need opioids for a very short period of time after orthopedic surgery, for example. The notion of a prescription, however, this may come up later in the afternoon, which provides a jar full, would imply that somebody somewhere has come to a conclusion about how many opioids that particular person at that age, depending on his or her circumstances, is likely to require in a reasonable pain management period. And what I hear you saying in terms of prescribing is that actually there is a huge gap between what is necessary, what is provided, and that is one of the sources of opiate liquidity in the marketplace, which then gets resold and stolen from medicine cabinets and problematic. So am I to believe, therefore, that physicians are operating, as I would always believe, in the best of faith, based on what they know, and have no actual structural guidance from their mentors about how much you should prescribe in the circumstance of a particular post-op or other painful context?
I think it was routine and probably is still routine in many places to give a 30-day supply of opioids after an operation or some sort of injury like a sprained ankle. And that, you know, maybe it's reasonable if you're giving someone a prescription for acetaminophen, Tylenol, or a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. Actually, I'm not even sure that it is appropriate there. But there's an incentive for doctors to do that, because if you give the patient a 1-week supply and they have 10 days of pain, that means they're going to come back or they're going to call you, and that's something you're going to have to deal with. But I think, and so that very quotidian reason for giving longer prescriptions happens in opioids. The other problem with opioids, though, is the one that Dr. Dalla mentioned, and it's that there's withdrawal involved. So the patients are even more likely to call you when the prescription runs out, not just because they may still be in pain, but because they're in withdrawal. So if you're seeing someone in an emergency room or you're seeing someone post-op, there's an incentive just to give them more pills than they need so they don't come back and call you, that they'll go and see someone else.
And I think related to that question, there's a real problem now of a new generation of physicians coming through who I do believe are being taught better. I kind of checked up on what's going on at UT, and it's quite a bit better than it was even just a few years ago in terms of the curriculum that they're exposed to and the way they're exposed to it. But when they get to the hospital, some, not all, but some of their mentors are still prescribing like it's 1999, right? And so they'll, you start to learn habits from these people that you really respect. And although starting to see some shifts, so for a while I was shocked by the amount of Percocet, oxycodone, OxyContin coming from my patients from the emergency department, just stunned by it. I actually thought it was dangerous. And that seems to be slowing down, but I certainly see post-op people getting big numbers of days of medications that, and I try to get them off, like without causing them discomfort or anything, try to get them off it pretty quickly.
Well, now there's another element to this story with which you are intimately familiar for having exposed it, which related to the involvement of the pharmaceutical industry in curriculum on pain management at the University of Toronto. I think it's a story that is germane to this discussion.
Sure, and I was glad to see that the first Massey Grand Round Symposium was about the connection between the pharmaceutical industry and medical education. When I was a medical student, there was a series of lectures on pain management that I attended, and I thought were perfectly fine as a student. And then I was on the wards. Actually, Dr. Dallo was my supervisor, and I was a resident at the time, and I was sort of indirectly supervising a medical student. And we had a patient who was admitted with acetaminophen toxicity, so a Tylenol overdose. And the student wrote a standard order for a pain medication that included acetaminophen, which would not make any sense in a patient who is admitted for acetaminophen poisoning. And she obviously didn't know what was in these pills that she was writing the order for. But she said that it was in her notes, it was in her lecture notes, right? I don't know if you have ever been involved in medical education, but you know, the lecture notes, like if the lecture notes said I should do this, so now who are you to contravene the lecture notes? So I asked to see the lecture notes, and it brought back memories. They were the same lecture notes that I had received, and I did there were a number of statements in the lecture notes that concerned me that I thought were inaccurate and dangerous. So it turns out that the whole lecture series was funded by Purdue Pharma, was supported by Purdue Pharma, and that led to some changes that I think ultimately were for the better, at least at this university.
Looking at the various specialty disciplines, are there systematic differences in which pain is managed, depending on the discipline, comparing gynecological surgery to a neurologist treating pain, to an ER physician treating pain, to a cancer specialist treating pain? Are there systematic differences being taught and practiced that can make it impossible to have anything, a uniform policy that fits all?
Well, I think, there should be differences, for example, between, the prescribing of opioids for someone who's palliative, who has a life-limiting condition. And there are differences in the level of evidence for prescribing opioids for certain types of pain. Like there's a little bit more evidence for causes of pain like neuropathic pain, and almost none to support the use of opioids for something like lower back pain. So we should have different standards related to the effectiveness of opioids that reflect the difference in the effectiveness of opioids based on the cause. There are some things that are the same though, and those are the harms of opioids are exactly the same for someone with cancer pain versus someone with lower back pain, including the risk of overdose, which is real for someone who has cancer. So advice about, for example, the safe storage of opioids, what duration of opioids to provide a person with, those sorts of things can be the same. And the risks of diversion, someone else in the home taking the opioids, those things are all common.
So you talked about the American response to Purdue Pharma. I was wondering if there were any criminal investigations for this issue in Canada, or if there were any results.
Yeah. The answer is no. There apparently never was a criminal investigation, and I had some communications with the federal government about it, and they've said that they recognize that there were some issues in the past, and if those sorts of behaviors were to be repeated today, they would take action, but they're not planning to take any action. And there was recently a settlement for all of the people harmed by the opioid crisis in Canada. There's a settlement for $20 million in total to be divided up by thousands of people, so it'll be a few $1,000s each. And then each of the provincial and territorial governments agreed to, within that 20 million, to take $2 million. So that would compensate the governments for all of the care associated with the opioid crisis in Canada, $2 million for all of the provinces and territories. And they've agreed to that, which also means that the provinces and territories would find it difficult now to seek any more redress from Purdue Pharma.
Just a quick question. I'm a bit confused about the takeaway from this. So the problem, it seems, was originally created by this marketing scheme, but the marketing scheme ended quite quickly. So since then, it seems to be a physician-related problem with prescription rates continuing to rise, even though all the doctors know that it's not efficacious to do so. So your takeaway is that prescription rates should be dropped, but the cause is still pharma?
I don't want to say it's just pharma. I mean, even originally, like let's go back to the early 2000s, you could ask, so why were doctors listening to this message? Like, just because a drug rep came and told you that you should be prescribing this medication, you just started prescribing it. You didn't look yourself to see what the study said, or you didn't check this with your colleagues. So even initially, you could say, you know, the pharmaceutical industry, we could expect them to try and aggressively promote their medication. You could ask, doctors just sort of said, no, that's nonsensical. Come back to me when you have a study showing that this actually works for lower back pain, and come back to me when you have a study that shows that the risk of addiction is actually lower. But the reality is that message got out there, and it's not we're not talking about a historical problem. These medications are still marketed today, and that the view about them being effective and the view about them having a lower abuse potential, you could read about it even in the 2017 National Opioid Guidelines. There's a statement about short-acting opioids being associated with more misuse. So that message is still being distributed today. In terms of what should we do today, I think we should accept there's no way to unwind what happened. There's no way to counter the messaging that Purdue Pharma and other opioid manufacturers put out. And so, you know, given that tens of thousands of Canadians have died and people are still dying, I think some more assertive action is needed, such as just withdrawing approval for these long-acting opioids that were inappropriately marketed.
So I was going to say that, you know, you just kind of almost said what I was going to say, which is that to suggest that reducing prescriptions at this point or prescribing practices strikes me as kind of like trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube, right? We kind of need a time machine if that's the answer. And I don't mean to sound facetious here at all, but I think if you went to a safe injection site or an overdose prevention site, or you went to the back alleys and you said, hey, don't worry, we're addressing this crisis, we're going to prescribe less, they'd be like, you know, we know what kind of response you'd probably get. So I guess my point is not so much that I disagree with that overprescribing is at the origin of this story, but I think going forward in this conversation today, and I apologize, I'm one of maybe the few non-doctors here, but we need to make sure it's very clear what we're talking about when we say crisis. What are we talking about? Are we talking about exposure to opiates? Because that's not something agreed upon by everybody as what the crisis is. It could be death, it could be lack of support, it could be lack of response, slowness of response. So I think going forward, I think maybe as part of the presentations we should say specifically.
Sure, I think the most specific definition would be the excess death rate since 1999, the excess opioid-related death rate. So that's what I would see as the opioid crisis, the fact that there are more than 3,000 Canadians dying every year of opioid-related deaths. That did not happen in 1995. The number was much lower. And I'm not sure I totally understood what you were getting at when you mentioned people who are at safe injection sites who are currently dependent on opioids. So absolutely, I think that we should be providing treatment, we should be providing opioid agonist substitution therapy like methadone and buprenorphine, and obviously we should be providing naloxone to stop people from dying. But what I am saying is that that's not going to end the opioid crisis, because people are being started on opioids today. There are people who haven't used opioids, although we think that the message has gotten out there. There are people who haven't used opioids in the past who are being prescribed high doses of opioids, you know, above what is recommended, even above the 90 milligrams of morphine. New starts today. So I think that is what we need to address in order to end the opioid crisis. And then after the opioid crisis is over, we're still going to need to provide support for the people who are harmed by the opioid crisis. And also, there is this baseline rate of opioid use and opioid-related harms that we still need to address.
All right. Just in the interest of time, I think we should move on. Thank you so much for being here. We would like to present you with this yellow umbrella and the MGR logo on it too. Thank you so much. Thank you.
This is because of climate change, right?
Because of climate change. Also have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Melvin Gahan, Associate Professor of Department of Family and Community Medicine at the University of Toronto. He'll be giving us his presentation about public health response to the opioid crisis. Dr. Gahan, thank you. Go through the slide.
Thank you, and I thank you again for the honor of this invitation. I have no conflict of interest to declare. The objectives of the talk are to focus on the public health response to the opiate crisis. What are the components, what are the limitations, and what are the steps forward? Just some background, I think it's already been given, but the opiate crisis continues to get worse. In Ontario, there were estimated to be over 1,000 opiate-related deaths. In the same time period in 2016, there was only 694 deaths, so we have a very large increase. Similarly, a large increase in ED visits, 7,650 in that whole year, compared to 4,450 in 2016. So things are getting worse. The overdose death rate now exceeds deaths from motor vehicle accidents. In the United States, at least, more people are dying of opiate overdose than of breast cancer. These are young people in general. The mean age is around 40. And of course, there are many other harms besides overdose. There's sepsis and other infections. There's unemployment, family breakup, crime, and suicide. That's just some examples. The crisis has changed dramatically since 1999 and the early 2000s. Powdered fentanyl is now a main contributing factor. This is manufactured in illegal factories in China, more or less, and exported to Canada and the United States. In the early 2000s and mid-2000s, it was mainly, as Nav said, prescription opiates, controlled release opiates such as OxyContin. I think that what's happened is that Big Pharma, including Purdue and other companies, have created a large pool of patients who are addicted to prescription opiates. And now, for economic reasons, many of these patients are switching to heroin and other illicit opiates. They've created a huge market for it. At one point when I started off, the heroin users were a very small, marginalized criminal subculture, and now it's extended everywhere. You can see from the cost, one bag of heroin, which is about 100 milligrams or 0.1 grams, costs $35 to $40. Very accessible for a lot of people. In fact, that's lower in price than the equivalent amount of hydromorphone or prescription hydromorphone. And what is sold as heroin often contains variable, sometimes very large amounts of fentanyl, because fentanyl is actually much cheaper to produce than heroin, and it's much more potent than heroin, estimated to be about 10 times as potent. So this is an economic and very shrewd decision by the drug cartels and the drug manufacturers to make this product that's very hard to stop to crossing the border, because you can get it in such small amounts, and this has contributed greatly to the crisis. I want to say before going on that Irfan is totally right that the background to this, the substrate is social issues, unemployment, loneliness, boredom, lack of meaning. This has been shown over and over again. If you look at Glasgow, for example, in Scotland, in the 50s, they were a huge manufacturing base. They made ships worldwide, and they had low rates of addiction and crime and so on. And then the shipping industry, for various reasons, left. And what happened was a massive rise in unemployment, but also a massive rise in alcohol-related deaths and heroin and other causes. So this is part of it. The deaths of despair, opium and heroin and illicit opiates make people feel really, really good. They give them a sense of peace, of calm, of euphoria, of relaxation, of, so it's like in the arms of the angel, as the song says. So the provincial response on going into the various components, take-home naloxone is now available at no charge and without a prescription at community pharmacies. And it's distributed now to people on release from prison who are at very high risk for overdose. Both intramuscular and intranasal naloxone are being funded, kits are being funded. The intranasal is much more expensive, but it tends to be more acceptable to bystanders who have to quickly respond to an overdose victim. The limitation is that, at least as of now, it's not readily available in other settings. So if a patient is in the emergency department, they're not necessarily going to go to a community pharmacy later, and there needs to be a plan to distribute it everywhere. Concerts, shelters, prisons, withdrawal management, primary care, hospitals, and emergency departments. Supervised injection services and overdose prevention sites. Just a small technical point. The first refers to places where there's a stable building, funding from the ministry, and nurses and nurse practitioners on site. Overdose prevention sites are more of a spontaneous community reaction. They may set up a tent or so on, but the ministry does fund those as well with supplies of naloxone and clean needles and oxygen and so on. There are 7 supervised injection services in Ontario. As far as I know, Toronto has 3, and there's 4 overdose prevention sites have been improved. So they're starting. They're still not nearly enough for the need, but they are starting. And both services can resuscitate people from an overdose, and they can provide harm reduction services like clean needles and so on. OAT is opiate agonist treatment, and both Irfan and Nav referred to that. Methadone and buprenorphine are opiates, but they have some unique properties that allow them to treat opiate use disorder. They're very slow onset of action and a very long duration of action. So in the right dose, they relieve symptoms of withdrawal and craving and opiate use for a full 24 hours without causing sedation or cognitive impairment or euphoria. They have been extensively studied through multiple controlled trials, and they have been shown to reduce overdose mortality, to improve social functioning and mood, to reduce crime rates, and so on. So there's about 47,000 patients currently on OAT in Toronto, or in Ontario rather. So that's a very large number, and it continues to increase, but it's still not enough to kind of cope with all the out-of-treatment people who are starting to use injection opiates. The limitations of OAT are that it's not available in rural areas, so it's mainly concentrated in the large cities. And I think we also have a social problem with these methadone clinics. They're very specialized. They only provide methadone or buprenorphine. They don't provide primary care. And OHIP, they're entirely funded by fee-for-service. So they basically force patients to come once or twice a week to receive a prescription, to get a urine drug screen, and then they're given their medication. And this is a very coercive type of care that interferes with patients' daily lives, interferes with their work and family responsibilities. So as a result, there's a lot of dissatisfaction among patients with this, and the annual treatment retention in Ontario is very low. It's only around 38 to 48%, which is much lower than you would get in high-quality clinics. So I think that, and patients who do drop out of treatment are at extremely high risk of overdose death, because they lose their tolerance, they go into severe withdrawal, they relapse to heroin or fentanyl, and then they're at risk for dying. So this is, I think, a very big problem in our public health response. There are rapid access addiction medicine clinics. I've been involved with that over the years. The ministry has funded to date probably close to 40 rapid access clinics in the various 14 LHINs Each clinic is staffed by a physician or a nurse practitioner, plus a counselor or case manager. The idea is rapid access looked without any barriers, so patients can walk in without an appointment or without a referral. They are given buprenorphine if indicated on the first visit, plus counseling and follow-up and referral to community services. The idea is that once the patient is stable, they will then be referred to a primary care setting. So that's going very much against the kind of dominant paradigm now. Now, if a patient presents to the emergency department or hospital, most of the time they're sent home with nothing. No counseling, no medication, no naloxone, no harm reduction advice, and no follow-up. It's just, okay, we've revived you from your overdose and you're on your way. And the treatment available is hard to access. It's often in various difficult locations and they require assessments and so on. So we're trying to integrate addiction care directly into the healthcare system. The limitations are that many RAM clinics have restricted hours. Ideally, they would be open, 20 all the time. And primary care clinics are very reluctant to take on patients who are on buprenorphine, even if they're stable and doing well. And like I say, most EDs, hospitals, withdrawal management are not using buprenorphine, even though it's safe and effective. Any physician can prescribe it. So the kind of tragedy in a way is that, again, you have patients presenting with a life-threatening complication of their opiate use and they're receiving no treatment whatsoever. Medical education initiatives that are going on. The goal of them, and Nav alluded to them, is to encourage physicians to select patients more carefully for opiate therapy, that they should have a medical condition that warrants opiate therapy, and you want to titrate carefully, avoid high opiate doses, taper safely, and when needed, treat opiate use disorder. And there's been a number of guidelines that have come out, the Canadian opiate guidelines, the Health Quality Ontario prescribing guidelines, the guidelines around opiate use disorder put out by HQO, the CRISM guidelines, which is a national consortium of in the addiction field, the opiate prescribing reports, which are mailed to primary care doctors. There's also the Ministry of Health is creating online modules on safe opiate prescribing and opiate use disorder, chronic pain management. And then the CAMH was funded to put on an educational program and share care with family health teams across the province. Then there's a very large academic detailing program. Most of these things are in the planning stage and they will be rolled out either later this year or next year. There's various publications. The Center for Effective Practice has come up with a great book, whose name I forget. The Institute for Safe Medication Practices has a pocket card and so on. But, of course, there are limitations. For one thing, they're often ignored, and there's, I think Dr. Wilson mentioned that emergency departments commonly prescribe potent opiates such as Percocet or hydromorphone for pain conditions that shouldn't be treated with any opiates. So they can be ignored. People just go on the basis of the habit and what they've learned and what their senior partners is prescribing and so on. And also there's a pervasive reluctance among all physicians, primary care, EDs, and hospitals to prescribe buprenorphine. I think that indicates probably it's a result of two things. One is the feeling that opiate use disorder has nothing to do with the healthcare system, is not a medical responsibility, it's somebody else's responsibility, presumably a methadone clinic. And one is pervasive stigma against patients with opiate use disorder that who wants to be associated with them, they're, etc., liars and bad people. So that is, I think, a barrier to getting people effective treatment. And also primary care providers are afraid to continue opiate prescribing. Now, we know that patients who are in high doses should be tapered, especially if they are having complications of their opiate therapy, but the taper needs to be done safely and slowly, and the patient needs to be referred or started on buprenorphine if they have an opiate use disorder. But what we're seeing now is primary care doctors who are firing patients for a variety of reasons, and the patients are not able to get their care from anywhere else. So doctors will say, oh, you're on opiates, I'm not going to be your doctor. So you have the orphaned patients who then are at risk for getting illicit opiates, which puts them at risk for death. So, tapering and safe prescribing, or deprescribing as it's often called, makes a lot of sense, but only if it's done in a medically supervised, clear, and safe way. If you're trying to ditch patients, you're going to cause tremendous problems. Injection opiate therapy, those are programs that provide daily injections of hydromorphone or diacetylmorphine, which is heroin, to patients who have failed OAT, and thus avoiding the risks of illicit opiates that are contaminated by fentanyl. There are several IoT programs being planned. I don't think any is operational yet in London and Ottawa and Toronto. The limitations are that they're very expensive. They'll reach only a small number of opiate users in the downtown core of large urban centers. And they're based on a very elastic and uncertain definition of opiate failure. The fact is that the great majority of patients who are addicted to heroin are going to want free, legal injection hydromorphone if it's offered to them. And they would far prefer that to methadone or buprenorphine. So what you're going to have is a very large pool of unhappy, dissatisfied patients who are not able to get onto IoT. And from a public health perspective, there's no question that it would be far better if these patients had immediate and comprehensive access to high-quality OAT, including methadone and buprenorphine. Finally, abstinence-based programs. These include withdrawal management centers, residential addiction treatment programs. There is a variety, and they've been there for many years. They're there for all substances, alcohol use disorders, and so on. They provide individual and group counseling and follow-up and self-help groups and so on. Their limitations are that they're far less effective than OAT, and that's been demonstrated in controlled trials. And they seem to have, many of them seem to be quite resistant to OAT, and they have, as a policy, some of them have not allowed patients on methadone or buprenorphine into their program, and they aren't willing to start it when patients are in their program and want it. Now, this is a terrible problem because there's good evidence that patients who are discharged from an abstinence-based program are at higher risk for death, exactly because when they overdose, they've lost tolerance, than if they had continued using. So there needs to be, I think, definite reformation of the abstinence-based programs. So what are the next steps? I think wider distribution of naloxone is critical through emergency departments, hospitals, and so on. I think expansion of supervised injection sites and overdose prevention sites and RAM clinics is indicated. Medical education, I think, needs to be backed with some teeth, and that would come from medical regulators, such as the College of Physicians and Surgeons, and it should emphasize physicians' responsibility to taper patients safely, not to fire them just because they're on opiates or discharge them, but to manage it carefully and safely, and to prescribe buprenorphine and dispense naloxone and give advice on harm reduction when indicated. OAT, I think we desperately need a new funding model. The OHIP fee-for-service model has failed and it's harming patients. And I think the College of Physicians and Surgeons, again, needs to enforce some clinical standards. If you have methadone clinics that are providing, forcing patients to have meaningless clinical visits simply to generate fee revenues, I think it's time for the regulators to step in. Furthermore, community health centers and family health teams need to have accountability agreements with the MOH. I think it's entirely unacceptable for any primary care clinic to say, no, we're not going to prescribe buprenorphine to a patient any more than they can say, well, we're not going to prescribe antipsychotics or whatever because we don't want to deal with those patients. So there has to be, I think, some response of the ministry, the medical regulators, hospital administrators to, in essence, demand and require some kind of clinical standards on the part of physicians and nurses and other agencies. Emergency departments and hospitals have to follow best practices. The evidence is overwhelming that they should be prescribing buprenorphine on site, and I think they need to be starting to do that. So, and same with abstinence-based programs. I think they need to have a change in policy. So in summary, I think we have a modern tragedy, an iatrogenic epidemic caused by big pharma and caused by pain specialists and others who promoted these dangerous products. And by and large, the healthcare system is ignoring this and not being involved. And so now we have to, I think, take charge. It's up to the healthcare system, I think, to do a much better job than we're doing now. But I want to say there is reason for hope, and here's an example from Sioux Lookout in Northern Ontario, which is a community of about 50,000 people, First Nations, in 30 or so very small remote Indigenous communities. And they have been asking for years for treatment and support with little help from the government, from CAMH or other agencies. And they have now taken matters into their own hands, and they've set up their own buprenorphine programs. These are where buprenorphine is prescribed not by addiction specialists, but by on-site primary care providers or fly-in nurse practitioners in some cases in consultation with addiction physicians. Each program is designed and operated by the community itself and funded by the community itself, uses traditional healing approaches. And the remarkable thing is how well they're doing, despite the fact that they are like 1/10 of the resources of your average methadone clinic. They have very high treatment retention rates, patients are doing really well, and on every measure of community wellness, they've improved. Markedly reduced crime rates, improved school attendance, reduced childhood apprehensions, and reduced overdose deaths. So I think there is room for hope as long as the healthcare community and the public at large is mobilized. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kahan. Thanks. We are coming close to the break. If we had any one or two questions, we could address them now, or we have a panel talk after. But feel free, if you can ask a question.
Doctor, I had to look up iatrogenic. I'm a history major. But it strikes me as a very, very serious allegation, or in this case, substantiated conclusion to come to say that it is physicians and to some extent the pharmacy industry that caused the disease.
Yes.
If I understand what iatrogenic means, having learned about it in the last 4 seconds,
Right.
Is that what you're saying?
Well, there's no question that, and I was around, I was a young physician at the time that the epidemic started, and I know what Purdue did. They had, it was the most diabolically brilliant marketing campaign in history, and wildly successful. They identified physicians, and Nat went into this, they identified physicians' concerns about opiates, that they caused addiction and so on, and they just basically made up 3 or 4 simple messages that you give opiates in any dose, it's completely safe, they're not addicting, addiction is rare and can be easily spotted and dealt with. So they had these false claims, and they hired specialists from all over to go and tell family doctors, well, there's good evidence for this, and if you don't prescribe, then you're opiophobic and you're harming your patients. So now this created this kind of monstrosity, and you have a cohort effect.
So the doctors that were trained in, in the 90s, who are now, probably in their 50s and 60s, they're having trouble changing their prescribing habits. It's pretty hard, actually, to suddenly say, well, to patient, sorry, I'm cutting you down. That's very hard to do. And the younger physicians are probably much more cautious, but you have a very large number of patients who are entrenched in a certain prescribing habit. And now you have fentanyl, which has made everything 10 times worse, because it's patients who, for whatever reason, can't get prescription opiates. It's a lot easier to get heroin. It's not that expensive. It's easily available. You don't have to go to a doctor or find a patient or whatever. You just buy it. And and it's Russian roulette, right? I mean, no one thinks they're going to die of an overdose. They think they know how to judge the effect and so on. So it is indirectly, at least, I think, an iatrogenic or medicine-caused epidemic. And what's tragic is that the healthcare community has refused, I think, by and large, to take responsibility and do something about it.
And sorry, the one last question before the break.
Thank you for your informative talk. Can you comment on the surveillance of the contents of illicit street drugs as a public health intervention?
There is, for example, in the supervised injection sites, they do have testing for fentanyl, and what they're finding is that most heroin samples do, in fact, have fentanyl in them. The big question, so and certainly we have the capacity in our clinic to test for fentanyl through the urine drugs sample. The problem is that there's no evidence yet that telling someone, well, what you just used had fentanyl in it, will actually stop the behavior. Because many people are still saying, well, I know my dealer, he wouldn't do that to me, or I'll be more careful next time, or I can taste or tell in some way how much fentanyl there is. So it doesn't seem to have led to a change in behavior. It's a very similar problem to the early days of the HIV epidemic, when we were telling people, you should be careful about who you have sex with. And they said, no, we know, I can tell whether my partner is healthy or not. So it's fentanyl testing has been looked at, but not very encouraging results so far.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Khan. I'd also like to gift you with our special yellow MDR umbrella. I'd also like to remind everyone that Dr. Khan will be staying afterwards as a discussant on our roundtable, so if you have more questions, hold those for just a few more moments. So I'd like to now take a break. Some refreshments will be served in the junior common room across the hall, and we'll return back for our panel talk at 10 to 3.
Thank you everyone for coming back. We'll start this session again. I'd like to introduce Priya here and Julia Lamala, two Massey Grand Round members who will be introducing the panel. Also, as a side note, for the millennials out there, we have a Snapchat filter of the symposium. So if you do take pictures, feel free to share it with the with your friends. Julia,
Guess we're not doing Facebook, right?
Based on yes, no, sure. Cambridge Analytica. So up next, we have a wonderful roundtable and panel discussion, which will be chaired by Dr. Lynn Wilson. And just a little bit about Dr. Lynn Wilson, you might have already read that in the panelist description, but she completed her undergrad at McMaster and then MD and postgraduate training at U of T, and has been a practicing family physician since 1986. And I think she'll introduce a lot of the other speakers later. And then Rita just has a little bit more.
Okay, so Dr. Wilson has played a leadership role throughout her work with some of the faculty's key partners. So from 2002 to 2007, she was a member of the Physician Services Committee for the Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, where she has helped to lead primary care renewal in the province of Ontario. And since 2011, Dr. Wilson has been the co-director of Bridges, a Ministry of Health funded project to support the design and implementation of innovative models of care that promote the integration in the healthcare system. Her current global health work in the department also includes working with the faculty at Addis Ababa University to implement a first ever family medicine residency program in Ethiopia. Dr. Wilson practices family medicine at Women's College Hospital Family Health Team in Toronto, and her clinical interests also include palliative care, addiction medicine, obstetrics, and global health.
So Dr. Wilson.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm privileged to moderate the panel. We've got three fantastic panel members, and I'm glad Beth is there so that we didn't end up with a man, all right? So you're going to have to excuse my voice. I'm a little bit hoarse right now. I don't quite sound like my usual self. I was asked to provide some comments. I think I'll do as everybody else has been doing. I was asked to provide some comments about what this has all looked like to me through the years as a family doctor. And what I want you to know is that I really am a generalist family physician. I don't practice very much now, but I certainly practiced a lot through the years. But I did get involved through the years on the academic side and to some degree clinically around the whole use of substance use disorders in primary care. So I'm just going to give you a few highlights, and I'm going to try and interweave it with what you've already been hearing. But before I do that, I want to understand our audience a little bit better. How many people here consider themselves to be a healthcare professional? So a fair number of you. How many of you are maybe like basic scientists? In the humanities? Good. And others, engineers, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, fantastic. I just want to get a feel for it. All right, and first of all, I do bring you greetings from the Faculty of Medicine and from our Dean, Trevor Young, who couldn't be here, but was delighted to see that the Massey Symposium was addressing this really important issue. And thank you to the organizers. You've done a really nice job. Much appreciated. Okay, so I've been in family medicine for 32 years, and I feel that I have been watching, as of many of us, an absolutely remarkable evolution in clinical practice with respect to opioids. In some cases, for example, in cancer-related pain, opioid prescribing has greatly helped our patients. And you've been hearing repeatedly today the amount of suffering that has occurred and the harms that have occurred to other patients using the exact same medications. So the medical profession cannot solve this problem on its own, and Mel, I thought you presented some really great suggestions, as of others, around where we need to go. But we most certainly have contributed and continue to contribute to this problem. And we must improve our prescribing practices. And just as importantly, and this isn't talked about enough, although I did hear Mel talking about it, we have to provide appropriate care to people who've got opioid use disorders. This really is a thing throughout the country of family doctors sort of panicking when they realize their patient has a problem. Maybe there's been a forged prescription or there's escalating requests for opioids, and it becomes apparent that they've got a bad problem. And I think a couple things happen. I think there is stigma. I think they get mad. Like, what do you mean you've not been using those drugs I gave you properly? And I think also I'm going to get in trouble. Everybody's talking about these bad doctors and they're misprescribing. So I've got to stop doing this right away because clearly this patient is in bad shape. And I don't really know what else to do with them. So they fire them, or they don't fire them, but they stop prescribing. And then you've already heard the horrible consequences of people then accessing opioids, illicit opioids, and having much greater risk of ending up with fentanyl in their system. I am happy to see that over the years some family physicians have stepped up and made strides in addressing this issue, and you've met a couple today by hearing Nav speak and Mal speak, but there certainly is much more to do. So I'm just going to talk a little bit, because I am so old and have done family medicine for so long, how it has looked to me through the years and what that all means for today. So my experience is shared with many people across the country and well beyond Canada. So I graduated from U of T Medicine in 1985, and we just learned the most basic facts about the pharmacology of opioids. And we were absolutely taught to be very careful in prescribing. I was like almost terrified to pull out my prescription pad and write a prescription for anything, much less anything like oxycodone. That we were taught that Percocet was like a really bad thing. I don't know if this brings back any memories for anybody else. You're nodding right now? Yeah. So now look what happens now, right? Kids call them perks, like or T3s for Tylenol 3, and I just think, wow, has our culture changed? We had an optional brief course in addiction medicine that was poorly attended, including by me, which is relevant to a story I'm going to tell you in a minute, and I'm not proud of that fact. And I did end up working at Addiction Research Foundation for 10 years, but I didn't go to the course because it wasn't on the exam. And that is a hidden curriculum, if ever there was one. So we had very little education regarding treatment of substance use disorders during our family medicine residency here in Toronto. Yet we were seeing patients continuously in the emerge and on the floors with devastating medical and social consequences from their substance use. And the thing that we absolutely did see as well, which I think is very sad and has shaped part of this story, is that the patients being seen in the emerge and on the floors were often considered to be an utter burden and not individuals who were ill and in need of compassionate care. Like, oh, here they are again, and really not spoken with very kindly, sometimes not spoken to very much at all. Sometimes it really was just the student who was spending time with the patient. And I think that's a very powerful hidden curriculum as well. But in the meantime, and nobody's really talked about this very much, palliative care was developing in Canada. So we didn't even have palliative care units until the mid-1970s. And the first national guidelines for palliative care were published by Health and Welfare Canada in 1981. So when I started practice in 86, I came onto faculty at U of T, and I was working at the teaching unit at Toronto Western, and we had started a palliative care service. Larry Liebrecht, a wonderful family doctor, was one of the pioneers in Canada. And what was happening is some physicians, so we would do consults. We weren't allowed to write orders because the attending physician had to okay it. And some physicians declined to refer their patients to palliative care. They didn't want anything to do with it. And others were very anxious about the use of opioids. And they would refuse to follow some treatment suggestions we were making. So listen to how different that sounds from what's ended up happening over the past few decades. So I personally learned about the use of opioids in treating cancer-related pain and what a big difference it could make in terms of bringing comfort to patients at the end of their life. And this learning was going on around the country during the late 80s and through the 90s. So think about what that means then, about doctors learning about getting comfortable with opioids. So, I grew up in the era of don't touch Percocet. So people were starting to get comfortable. They were using drugs like hydromorphone and morphine, and they were getting great benefits with people who had their cancer-related pain. So now I'm going to give you this, I've given you this background because I'm going to share a story about how I learned the hard way about the challenges of treating non-cancer pain and how the principles of prescribing opioids for cancer-related pain aren't applicable to patients with other types of pain. And now that wasn't an obvious thing that anybody talked about say around, say 86, 90, 92. Do you know what I mean? And in fact, that was one of the ways that doctors got quite convinced that this was the way to go for treating non-cancer pain, because I think, if my memory's not that strong, but I remember one of the angles with the so-called drug talks that we would go to was that you use the same principles, right? And doctors have been highly criticized for not treating cancer pain appropriately, not using high enough doses, not titrating those drugs. And then they get into an environment where people are saying, well, you're going to use the WHO analgesic ladder, which we all knew from palliative care. And they absolutely did say, keep titrating until there's no pain. Well, that doesn't work, right? The pain never really goes away, and nobody ever talked about function. So I think what I'll do, because I think these folks need the time to talk, I just want to let you know that very early in practice, I made what I consider a prescribing error with a young patient I practiced. She was 35, a type 1 diabetic who'd been in a horrible car accident. She was new to my practice. She had osteomyelitis, which is bone infection in both legs with draining sinuses. She was in a lot of pain. And, I sent her to a physiotherapist. She saw a rehab physician, got braces for her legs. And I felt that it wasn't doing a lot for her, and I felt the need to treat her pain. And so I'd say this was 1990. I did the analgesic ladder, so I started with plain Tylenol. That wasn't doing much. I tried Tylenol with codeine, and she got a rash, which I saw. I tried oxycodone, and she vomited with it. And then I think this was terrible prescribing. I should have gone to those classes, I think, that optional course. But I then prescribed Demerol for her pills, which is a terrible analgesic, has lots of side effects, and can be pretty habit-forming pretty quickly. So within about 2 to 3 months, sure enough, she was requesting higher doses, running out of her prescription early. And thank goodness I at least recognized that was something I needed to deal with. And I'd met Mel just sort of incidentally, and I called him at Addiction Research Foundation. He saw the patient. He put her on a low dose of long-acting morphine to try to deal with the pain. We wondered if she would end up on methadone. She did perfectly. That was the end of that story. I was pretty upset with myself. I really felt that I'd made some fundamental errors, but I got profoundly interested in this area and in substance use disorders in general, and ended up working at Addiction Research Foundation and doing lots of research and education stuff with Mel. Okay, so now, I think the thing about that is that we've got fantastic guidelines. What made the difference here was, I think, I had rapid access to Malkahan. Now we have rapid access clinics. And I mean that quite seriously. What if I'd been in a small town, nobody around to ask? There wasn't much in the literature those days. I don't know where that would have gone. And I think Mel and I used to teach a course for the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario for doctors who've gotten in trouble with our regulatory authority for their prescribing practices. And a lot of them would talk about having trouble saying no to their patients. They would talk about, once they start prescribing for a couple of people, it's like the word went out, and now there were like dozens and dozens coming, and they're in small communities where there isn't much backup. And one of the things they liked most about the course was the 1-800 number we gave them for the old Addiction Research Foundation and CAMH, right? Somebody I can call because I want to help and I don't know what to do. Okay, I just want to talk a little bit more about why rapid access is such a big deal. And Mel is so modest, and I told him on the break I was ratting him out. Mel started this model. A few years ago, he had pilot funding from our Bridges project to create a model of rapid access to addiction care for people with alcohol or opioid use disorders. And there's some, and this was located in the hospital, and they would get the pharmacotherapy and counseling that he talked about. So if you were in the treatment arm, in the intervention arm, the average time to getting into a clinic was 1 day. If you were in the control arm, which was just usual care, the average time to get into treatment was 58 days. So 1 versus 58. And 83% of the patients in the intervention arm showed up to at least one appointment, compared to 29% in the control arm, because it's 58 days later, right? Their motivation might be down, or they're getting sicker and they're just not coming. So the nice thing is that Health Quality Ontario's Arctic program allowed Mel and colleagues to expand this H-SOAP to 7 additional sites in Ontario, including at Sioux Lookout, an Indigenous community, and with great success. This is called the Medify project. So Medify clinics, which are now in Toronto, again because of Mel, allow patients to refer themselves. They can walk in off the street. I can send my patients, the Emerge can, a clinician working in a hospital, or from a community agency. And there have been good evaluations done of the Medify clinics as part of the Arctic project. There's reduced opioid overdoses, reduced emerge room visits, reduced inpatient stays, and reduced costs to the system. So I'm lucky, right? I'm across from a clinic, literally footsteps away. And this is really helping a lot of my patients. There's a regular addiction medicine clinic, but there's rapid access. It's 3 times a week, right? Yes. You guys? Yeah, and it's great. I just made a referral the other day. The one thing I want to say, and Nav, I hope you can help me on this. I am an incredibly low prescriber. I really freaked myself out with that early problem, right? So I've got patients now who I'm still having to deal with their opioid problems. There's a young woman in my practice who's obtaining opioids using cryptocurrency. Whoa. A other young man who ended up needing buprenorphine because for the kratom that he was illegally accessing. So it's fascinating what's going on in the system. And I agree with you entirely about how much we own, but I'm always a bit fascinated around what else is at play here. Like you talk about fentanyl being easy to import in from China and what a game changer that is. So Mel mentioned a whole bunch of educational initiatives, and we've really improved that curriculum at U of T. And Nav is the ultimate whistleblower around that previous course. I think there's really good stuff, and I've got details, but I really feel I need to finish here. The one thing I have to say is that when we did our 10 years of our course, it was a very intensive, interactive follow-up support course for doctors who'd gotten into trouble with prescribing. We actually did a research study looking at prescribing rates. And what we found is that the day the doctor got a letter saying, there's a complaint from a patient, or there's an issue here with the college and you're under investigation, their rates drop precipitously. And we've already learned what happens if you suddenly cut people off instead of tapering them and getting proper treatment. And our course didn't appear to have an impact. Now, it was a health services type of study, so with using secondary data sets. So what we didn't know is whether people were doing it better. Once they went to the course, were they following some of the guidelines, etc. So Mel and I both, and many others, have been adamant, you can't just educate people, you have to change the system. You have to have really good access to treatment. Probably our college should be acting in a bit of a different way, and I won't get into details around that right now, but that education alone isn't going to be enough, and I've spent my life as a medical educator, so I just want to throw that out there. Okay, thank you. Now, my job is to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker, I'm working off 2 different pieces of paper, is a very, very famous professor from the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto, Dr. Benedict Fisher. And Benedict, you're going to talk about the 2-front challenge, effective prevention and treatment.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
And I will use this thing. I used to teach undergrad for many years, so I could probably do without the mic as well. But it's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon. First of all, my apologies that I couldn't be here for the full day. I made a big career choice mistake about 15 years ago when I decided to work on both cannabis and opioid issues. And one of the many collateral consequences that had today, for example, is that I was just at the Ontario Public Health Conference until about 30 minutes ago talking about cannabis legalization, and now I have the pleasure to be here with you. But I unfortunately missed a number of great talks earlier this afternoon. So we have just a few minutes to elaborate a little bit on our topics, and so I'll just give you a couple of snapshot comments on what, in my experience, and I should preface my comments, I come mainly from the public health perspective. Despite having a chair in psychiatry, I'm really a public health scholar primarily, so I look at this rather than from the individual clinical point of view, sort of from the population public health perspective. This crisis is the most mind-boggling thing that I've seen in my career. There are colleagues who have had longer careers than me, but I've been in this field now for a quarter century almost. And it is a mind-boggling crisis, not only for the extent and the severity of the impact, but also for the trajectory and the course that this has taken. And I should warn everyone that I don't think we've seen the peak, the crest of this at all. Just give it another few weeks and we'll have new mortality numbers from the federal government on overdose deaths for 2017 that will likely be far north of 4,000 dead people in 1 year related to opioids. There'll be new morbidity, hospitalization data that will also point greatly upward. So this hasn't even crested. So, and we've been watching this going on for a long time, and we've obviously, I have to say very clearly, been categorically ineffective in stemming and reducing this enormous public health impact, never mind eradicating or eliminating it. Part of the mind-boggling characteristics of this is that this crisis has been unfolding over a long period of time, I'd say for about a decade, where we just watched and did nothing, more or less, in terms of interventions and policy measures. And I think one of the most important questions, even though it's a historical one, is why did we not do that for such a long time? And why did we actually fail to take preventive action on a large-scale population level when this was still possible and the window of opportunity was there for about a decade? I stumbled into the prescription opioid problem almost literally by accident. I was a young independent scholar, early 2000s, and had a large study funded that was to look at characteristics of heroin users and heroin injectors across the country. The Opicant study began in 2001, did its first assessments, and we wrapped up our third assessment in 2004, and we looked at the data and realized that all of a sudden in the majority of sites across Canada, heroin users weren't using heroin anymore. They were pretty much all using prescription opioids. And first, I didn't really believe the data, but this was a seismic shift that basically happened in the early 2000s in the illicit market. Never mind, we at that point did not immediately realize that this is what was fueling and preempting a much larger trend overall, which was basically that the dispensing of prescription opioids was drastically but consistently increasing. The increase began in the early 2000s. Between 2005 and 2015, the dispensing, the overall volume of prescription opioids in Canada grew by about 250%. We became, together with the United States, the leader globally in terms of amounts of prescription opioids dispensed. In 2012, more than 1 in 5 Canadians had a prescription for prescription opioids. 1 in 5 Canadians were on potent prescription opioids by prescription. So despite the fact that we had sort of the anecdotal bits and pieces of death numbers came out, and then of course the seminal study by Irfan in 2009 with documenting the onset of OxyContin and how that was driving up mortality. But essentially until 2012, policymakers, system people, public health people were ignoring this problem, despite the fact that pretty much all the indicators were pointing up, the numbers were there, despite the fact that the Canadian data was always rather spotty and incoherent, but enough information was there, but it was largely neglected. And then all of a sudden people marched to action in 2012 and decided that it was time to do something. What did we do? We delisted OxyContin. In other words, we took the one drug, and no, I've never been paid by Purdue, but I'll say it anyway, the prescription opioid problem
all along was much more than OxyContin. OxyContin was at the core, it was the lion's share of problems. There were a lot of other drugs that were fueling the problems. So policymakers delisted OxyContin and thought that this was going to resolve this problem. What happened in terms of overall effects? Nothing, basically. What happened mainly was that we displaced the opioid problem from OxyContin away to other substances, primarily hydromorphone, fentanyl. Interesting enough, we displaced it to other drugs that are partly, I think, made by Purdue and sold by Purdue. That's part of the story that's never been recognized. So I was worried for a while that they would lose a lot of income, but I don't think they did. That's a cynical remark. And so this is basically what happened. So between 2012 and 13, you can literally look at the dispensing rates for OxyContin, oxycodone products going down in all the jurisdictions, and fentanyl hydromorphone fully substituting that, and fully correlated, of course, the morbidity and mortality numbers related to these drugs. So overall, things kept creeping up. So we took pretty much ineffective measures. There were a bunch of other ideas and concepts thrown around. For a while, primarily under the Harper government, people believed a lot in drug formulations that would deter abuse or were supposedly safe. Mel has written seminal stuff on that, which is basically nonsense. We brought in a narcotics monitoring program in Ontario that, for reasons I still don't understand, is not real time and isn't available in real time for physicians and pharmacists. So I think a lot of the potential utility in prescribing and dispensing practice is not there, despite the technology fully existent and in use in many other jurisdictions. We simply did not clue in what to do to roll this in. And part of the issue was, of course, also if you read the original McMaster prescribing guidelines for opioid prescribing from 2010, if you read them in detail, they're basically a guideline for prescribing of opioids. They're not a guideline that deals with opioid prescribing in a cautious way. There's basically nothing in there that says, if risk factor X, or if you've done it for that, stop or go down. It's pretty much instruction for prescribing, like a prescribing promotion guideline. So there are all these pieces coming together that kept fueling the dispensing, and the epidemiological data shows very clearly that harm outcomes, mortality and morbidity are almost perfectly correlated on the population level with dispensing. So in other words, the more you dispense, the more mortality, the more diversion, the more morbidity you have. So we basically needed effective interventions to rein in the excessive prescribing that's been fueling this thing. Now, of course, after 2012-13, we were at a point where primary prevention became almost impossible because we had so many people exposed to these opioids and habituated into problematic use or misuse or non-medical use that the prevention train had basically run away, and we basically moved ourselves into the emergency situation that we've been seeing over the last 3-4 years. So we really missed the boat. Policymakers, our systems missed the boat for primary and targeted prevention. Now we're at a situation where through, and I sort of skip a few chapters here if you will, but where over the last 2-3 years, partly with new guidelines, physicians have become worried, policymakers have finally sort of clued in that this is a real problem. So what happened? We basically started reining in prescribing through a number of measures, but we have such a large population of people exposed and at risk already for those drugs. And by the way, it's interesting that we don't really have any solid numbers on those. And we've done some of the epidemiological projections on the numbers, the population sizes of people who've been exposed to opioids and likely non-medical users or misusers. We're talking somewhere in the neighborhood between probably 1 million and 3 million Canadians. So this isn't some marginal boutique problem. This is a major population health problem with large population sizes at risk, where primary prevention yes, we need to do that for the long term to prevent more onset and more undue exposure. Right now, in this current public health emergency, we need to figure out what to do to bring the numbers of body bags basically down and prevent things like acute overdoses and the very acute problems. Now, there's been a lot of talk about treatment, and I fully agree we need to expand the range of treatment options. We need to bring more people into treatment. At the same time, the kind of clinical treatment that we have available right now will only solve the acute public health emergency to a certain degree. We will also not eradicate this problem through emergency measures like naloxone or safe injection site. That really only reaches a small proportion of the acute non-medical use or at-risk use that make people overdose and brings them to death. So we have to focus on what the real measures at hand are that are really required. And I think the big thing that has been missed, and that has been too hot to touch for politicians and policymakers, is that we really need to think about this as a public health emergency, like an Ebola crisis or a SARS crisis or a flu outbreak, where we go and identify the people at risk. And this is really, we're talking a few million Canadians who've been, for medical or non-medical reasons, exposed to those drugs, who've been habituated into non-medical or risky use. We need to identify them, and we need to deal with the issue that's driving most of the harms, which is now mostly toxic drug supply. Because the very complicated story is that we have reined in prescribing, but we've created supply gaps for a lot of people who've been habituated and who are involved in these drugs, who are now, instead of going to their second or third physician or to the diversion supply, they're going to the streets and they're obtaining the illicit clandestine fentanyl or fentanyl analogs or whatever the toxic drugs are. That's what's killing a lot of the people. Not exclusively, but a lot of people. We need to identify those people, and right now, as an emergency measure, we need to make sure that those people stay away from toxic drug supply, which probably in practice, in explicit term, means we need to give them safer opioids to prevent acute harms as a public health emergency measure. That is kind of an untouchable right now for most politicians and policymakers. In my view, don't get me wrong, this often erroneously goes into a binary black and white thing. I'm not at all against naloxone or safe injection sites. I think they form an important part, but not a non-sufficient part of the solution puzzle right now. We need much more aggressive, direct interventions that protect the several millions of Canadians that are involved with these drugs right now, for better or worse, and keep them away from toxic drug supply. We're not doing any of that right now, and I think that's one of the reasons why, very unfortunately, the harm numbers, death numbers, hospitalizations will keep going up. And we don't want this crisis to end like other public health emergency crises have ended, in that the crisis runs itself out because we're running out of people to die.
Very sobering. I think we have time for one question. Maybe can we, is there a comment that either Beth or Nav would like to make, and then we could take a question? Okay, you're fine. And I saw another hand up here.
I guess is that on? Well, I just want to say that I do agree, and I think that the more discussions around this, what seemed like a radical idea. There have been discussions around would it make sense for people to be able to get their safe opioid supply through pharmacies, for example, so that they are, it's not part of a formal treatment program, but, some safe supply, safe consumption site, different models could be proposed. And I think that there might be more openness to this because of this crisis and the direct response that's needed from the contaminated supply perspective. I think it has to be done in conjunction with the prevention piece still, and the improvements needed to the healthcare system, which will form some of my remarks in a minute.
Okay. And then this woman here.
So first of all, just taking off from what you said, Lynn, one of the best pieces of teaching advice I got when I was a medical resident was that there were really 3 ways to change behavior. Education, which only increases awareness, changing the environment, which has the most major impact, and finally laws, but they're only as good as people will enforce them. I'm not hearing that full picture here. We've all been doing the education. Physicians have heard the education part, and as you say, they're dropping their prescribing. Where are the major environmental changes? And then the legal stuff. Why is it we're getting so much of this contaminated with fentanyl stuff? Where is it that the law enforcement group is failing us for it coming into the country, if it's made in China? And environmental change, what environmental changes? I think it's a very innovative thought you had for essentially doing a targeted Ebola thing. I just don't know that they're so easily identifiable to find in our society to trying to rescue them. I think we need some major environmental changes that will, and the no smoking program that we did in the 1980s was revolutionary. And then I think it was a Swiss study in the 1980s that put their heroin addicts on maintenance heroin, and they ended up having vastly improved quality of life and going back to work some. So where's the environmental changes that could be fundamental?
I'm afraid I'm not sure exactly what you mean by environmental change.
Well, I give you the smoking. When they took the ashtrays off the restaurant tables, people didn't smoke in restaurants.
But what would you take away from the environment to make people stop using opioids?
Well, I'm wondering where we can stop getting the access to the ones that are so damaging. What can we do more?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, I don't think that those thoughts are really realistic. I mean, first of all, it's been sort of a traditional way of thinking that when dealing with substance misuse, if we just take the supply away, that the problem goes away. That's typically not really what's happening. But outside of that, even if that were, I think our chances of us being able to do that effectively are close to nil. And I think in some ways we've been kind of happy that there's now been the influx of opioids from faraway countries with evil people and traffickers, and we don't have to think about the mistakes that the medical system has made in creating this problem. But even if we were banking all our bucks on law enforcement and interdiction, it's impossible to even make a dent in this problem. There's no way. And in a way, we have to recognize the fact that right now, what's going on with the influx of illegal opioids is that they're basically filling a supply gap that has been created by the domestic system, right? You can correlate pretty much all the deaths that are occurring now with fentanyl analogs and the clandestine products are filling exactly the gap that has been created by the reduced prescribing and diversion from the medical system. So we can't bank on enforcement. This is not promising in any way. It would be lost time. And for the analogy with vaccinations or other public health crises, I was around here during SARS. There were enormous efforts going on to identify people who were potentially exposed to SARS and potential carriers of the risks. I stepped into ARF every day and there was a thermometer and a health check. We can identify most of these people if we want to. I don't think that it's fathomable right now for the public health sector to do that, and I simply think it's a matter of will right now. But if we identified the majority of the people at risk, I think we'd have a great chance of getting at people with risky behaviors and doing something about the drug supply. Just a last comment, we cannot put, as innovative injectable opioid pharmacotherapy is, you cannot put 2 or 3 million Canadians on injection heroin therapy at $50,000 cost per head and year. That is just not possible for implementation. We have to think about the safe drug supply issue in different models, for example, along what Beth may talk more about.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next panelist is Dr. Beth Spruill. Beth is a clinician scientist and an advanced practice clinical leader in pharmacy at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health and is an associate professor at the Leslie Dent Faculty of Pharmacy and Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. And Beth, you're going to talk to us about where pharmacists fit in with this.
Yeah, so I guess a lot of the previous talks have kind of framed well the context for what I'd like to share and focusing on how pharmacists and the profession of pharmacy can fit in with this in helping the solution. So I think that as you've all heard now, there's this large cohort of people who have been exposed and developed opioid use disorder and these problems, and of course one way is to provide a safer supply, but also needing to focus on both treating those, helping those people seek treatment, and as soon as they're ready, be able to have those supports there, as well as continuing the prevention efforts around reducing the prescribing, having alternatives for pain, early identification of people who might be running into problems with prescribed opioids. And I think for all of that, just the volume and the scope of the problem is that it can't be handled in specialty clinics and by specialized services for both pain or addiction. It really does need to, and as a lot of people have been talking about, moving out into primary care. The thing about primary care is, though, that we can't just say then that, okay, all the docs have to solve this problem. Primary care is a multidisciplinary effort. And I think that that's really where some of the demonstration projects around collaborative models of care that go beyond physicians and really work with allied health, pharmacists, other nurse practitioners, other healthcare providers to provide that support is really what we need to go. And right now our healthcare system isn't structured to facilitate that very well. It's very fractured. People are working in silos. And so I just want to use so I think from both a communication and collaborative point of view, we need better models. And also some of the examples where the specialty clinics and healthcare providers help then support primary care and have that back and forth communication as well is a really promising way to go based on some recent research. So I want to use pharmacists as a profession to kind of illustrate this point. And as a profession, our job is to ensure safe and effective use of medications. And so although we've been talking a lot about prescribers and contributing to the problem, we have to remember that there's been pharmacists dispensing these things all along as well and working with patients. But there's pharmacists working in a number of different areas. So in the specialty clinics, we have some very keen pharmacists working in collaboration in both addiction clinics and pain clinics and taking on a lot of primary roles in helping with opioid rotations and opioid tapering and working with methadone clients, for example. But also we have pharmacists in family health teams working primarily clinically, and then of course most people when they think pharmacists are thinking community pharmacies and supply of the medication. But they also have a mandate for clinical care of those patients because a lot of the actual dispensing duties are now handled by regulated pharmacy technicians. They're a profession on their own now, regulated through the Ontario College of Pharmacists, and they can dispense medications without the pharmacist double checking anything, but the pharmacist still has that clinical role, has to make sure that it's safe and appropriate therapy. So I think that we really do have a stake in this opioid problem. We've been part of the problem and we need to be part of the solution. And I think we can help on all four pillars of the Canadian drug strategy around prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and enforcement in some ways. So just to give you an idea how how pharmacists approach this is we provide what we call pharmaceutical care, same model as other health professionals where we assess the patients. We determine if they have any drug therapy problems, things like dose too high, dose too low, drug interactions, adverse effects, needing a drug that they're not getting, having drugs on board that they don't need, all of those types of things. Then we do a care plan, follow up, work in conjunction with the patient, and other healthcare providers. And I think this can be applied really well and could be more so when looking at the prevention side of things and really help manage these complex patients because being on an opioid for a pain condition, these patients don't just have pain and what we know from research is that they're very complex, that they also have mental health problems, they also have other addiction problems and are quite complex. I think that on the prevention side, pharmacists can also do things like promoting the opioid stewardship type activities, really helping with limiting quantities so that there's not so much volume of drugs that are out there. We know that a lot of opioids that are prescribed post-surgery aren't in fact used. You know, the usual things like promoting safe storage and safe disposal, bring back your opioids, those types of things. But I think that it goes beyond that in helping with provide non-opioid alternatives and making sure people have tried those first. So, you know, following the guidelines essentially and helping to implement the current guidelines. Also on the treatment side, I think that every pharmacy should be offering both methadone and buprenorphine services. I think it doesn't make any sense that only some pharmacies do, and you have this challenge of finding what pharmacy can provide those services. They could also be involved with rapid starts. You know, somebody gets a prescription from an emerge. Why can't they come to the pharmacy and have it filled and have the first dose observed, or be able to support in a better way? From a harm reduction point of view, of course, supporting naloxone. It's also, even though pharmacies are one of the major program from the Ontario government for providing naloxone kits, they're not available in every pharmacy, and they should be, and we're really trying to help promote that. Also good evidence for needle exchange programs out of pharmacies as well. From an enforcement or trying to reduce diversion point of view, you know, that's kind of the main thing we were taught in pharmacy school, was trying how to detect a forged prescription, those kinds of things, and I think that could be taken further again around limiting quantities and safe supply, etc. So I think that, you know, taking that a step further, there's a pharmacy in Vancouver that actually doubles as a safe consumption site, and with a pharmacist-led program. There's pharmacist-led opioid clinics in the U.S. that have shown quite a lot of benefit. You know, getting involved, at least in the discussion around how we might help with this current, the opioid overdose side of the current crisis, which is primarily currently to the contaminated supply. How can we help with that? But of course there's barriers to all of these things, and one is again around education or just feeling comfort with this. I think as with all health professionals, and has been mentioned here, that a lot of people, especially older professionals, have a lot of training in this area and still feel uncomfortable. And tied in with that is, of course, the stigma, which overrides all of this, and I think that's been the big barrier in the response to the crisis. People looking at people who use substances as kind of other, and not treating this as a health concern and health problem, and stigmatizing the use of substances is one of the biggest barriers for health professionals even wanting to get more education and being able to help tackle this problem. So I'll end there.
Okay, thank you very much, Beth. Questions for Beth, either from her fellow panel members or from the audience? Anybody? Oh, Irfan, please.
Thanks, Beth. It's not so much a question for Beth, but just a comment related to some of the other
Absolutely.
Comments. So enforcement doesn't work, right? And the people who have studied this a lot more than me, for sure, talk about something in the drug policy world called the iron law of prohibition, which is the more you crack down on any substance, the more potent that substance becomes, or the more potent varieties get circulated. So that happened with alcohol prohibition in the 1920s. It has happened with cocaine. It has happened with marijuana, and now we're seeing it happening with opioids. So it's very actually, and the number in BC, where the opioid crisis is probably the worst in Canada, the number of arrests for just simple opioid possession actually continues to increase. And so, you know, I know that we talk about this four-pronged strategy as if all four prongs are equal, but actually I think we need to de-emphasize enforcement. The second thing, I know Benedict was being facetious about this, or at least I think he was being facetious about how we're going to run out of people to die. Maybe not. I hope you're being facetious. We won't run out of people to die, because actually we're currently losing 1 out of 10,000 Canadians a year to opioids. We could lose 1 out of 10,000 Canadians in perpetuity. The crisis could easily get 5 times bigger, 10 times bigger before we really start to run out of people to die, just from a simple math perspective. So if people think that, well, we don't need to do anything because we will run out of people to die, and actually there is that view out there, right? Like I think there is this view that people will either find some other substance or they will die and the problem will go away. It will not go away. And the third thing I wanted to say is that I totally agree with Benedict. We need to make opioids much more widely available. So the answer is medication-assisted treatment needs to be easier for people like Billy and Megan to get than heroin. When they find it easier, fewer barriers to getting Suboxone or buprenorphine or methadone, and so it's everywhere. It's in the emergency department, it's in primary care, it's in the overdose prevention sites, it's in the supervised consumption sites. Then, they will have an easy way or easier way out of heroin and fentanyl. And then, for sure, there will be hopefully a small minority of individuals for whom there is no better option than pharmaceutical grade heroin or hydromorphone. But as Benedict said, it is just not feasible economically or organizationally to put 50 or 100,000 Ontarians a year on heroin or hydromorphone. And so it's much cheaper and safer, actually, to put people on, to offer buprenorphine.
Okay, well said.
Dr. Fisher, is marijuana a gateway to the opioids?
Not more than breast milk exposure.
So you don't anticipate any impact on the licensing and availability and massive increase in marijuana consumption?
How about homelessness or joblessness? Why are you
No, there's no data that would support that right now. Actually, as a matter of fact, there may be positive counter or substitution effects. So there's some data from ecological studies from the US that shows that in liberalized, legalized cannabis environments with increased availability of cannabis products, there's decreases in opioid-related morbidity and mortality, but we need much more rigorous data to figure out are there really causal effects. But there may be a bit of a sparing effect, actually, but we need to understand it better, and we need more original Canadian data on that.
Okay, this is all quite fascinating. And Nav, you're going to speak to us again, and you're going to talk about modifying prescribing habits. And, as the day goes on and more information and views get expressed, it gets more complicated, doesn't it? So, interesting hearing how you want to deal with this.
Well, 3 things about modifying prescribing. First, I think we have to identify the real problem. Second, I think we should reflect on what has definitely not worked. And then third, I think we need to think about doing something at least a little bit different. So to identify the real problem, there's way too much exposure to opioids right now. I think that is what changed after 1999, is more people were exposed to opioids and they were being exposed to higher doses of opioids. So I think that's the issue that we have to address. I think people in China would be surprised that in this discussion of the Canadian opioid crisis, China has come up so many times, especially like if you know anything about the opium wars, it would be, I think, a shock to people in China to hear that we're talking about a problem in British Columbia originating in China. I think that is, it's just not the way that the Canadian opioid crisis started. It didn't start in China. It's not being imported illegally from China. There was a problem here where doctors are inappropriately prescribing opioids. The rate went up after 1999, it more than tripled, and it has not substantially decreased since then. There was maybe potentially something like in Ontario, a 5% decrease that we've seen in the last year, but that's after it tripled. So it has plateaued at this dizzying height, and there is absolutely no sign that it's decreasing in any substantial way. Same thing in the United States. The opioid prescribing rate is very high, and it is not decreasing. And people will talk about all sorts of things that could have caused it. If you asked Coca-Cola why are so many children obese these days, they'll say, well, it's there's less physical activity, children are watching TV more, our cities are designed differently, so you can't walk to school. There's Snapchat filters now that kids know about, there's the Facebook. So there are all sorts of things. That's what Coca-Cola or Pepsi or Nestle will tell you about. And those points are valid, and to some extent they're true. But they're also a way to obscure and distract from another important reality, which is that for childhood obesity, part of the problem is sugar-sweetened beverages like Coke that kids are drinking and juice. And while we could talk about all sorts of things in the opioid crisis, we could talk about despair, we could talk about job loss, we could talk about child abuse. That sometimes comes up, adverse childhood experiences, that being one reason that people turn to opioids and other substances. I'm sure there's some validity to that, but that didn't start in 1999. The opioid crisis did. So we need to, I think, identify what is the real problem here. It's that too many people are being exposed to opioids at too high doses. In terms of what has not worked, I'll just list them because I think it's already been mentioned here what has not worked. Education has not worked. Telling doctors that you're doing a bad job of prescribing, writing clinical practice guidelines, the 2010 guidelines, they obviously did not have any beneficial impact on opioid prescribing. There's no sign that the 2017 guidelines that I was involved in are helping. Same thing in the United States, they had guidelines. There are directives from medical organizations and colleges that have not at all had an effect on opioid prescribing. Clamping down on individual doctors. Some doctors have gone to jail in the United States over their opioid prescribing. Their colleagues have kept prescribing opioids at the same rates. Introducing new formulations of opioids, first the long-acting opioids, then the so-called tamper-resistant opioids or abuse-deterrent opioids, has made no difference to the death rate. If anything, the death rate has increased. Government attention to the issue, the Minister of Health calling it an opioid crisis and saying to everyone that we need to get together and make this work has not helped at all. That happened 2 years ago. More people are dying each year. So I think that we need to not suggest that we try that again, that we write a different clinical practice guideline, or that we approve some new opioid product or some new type of opioid agonist substitution therapy, that we change the dose or make it a little safer. That's not going to help. Giving people more naloxone is going to save some lives, but it's not going to end the opioid crisis. So the last thing is we need to think of something different to do. And I'm not a very creative or imaginative person, so I haven't been able to think of some great solution to the problem. Maybe one of you is going to think of something better. But I think doctors allowed themselves to be misled about opioids, in particular about the benefits of these long-acting opioid products. And I think that there's no way to reverse the effect that mismarketing from pharmaceutical companies and the failure, I think, of individual doctors in the medical profession to guard against that misinformation. So I think one action that we could take is not to remove one or two products, but to withdraw approval for the whole host of long-acting opioid products. Basically all of the products that were introduced in the 1990s that were touted as having a lower abuse potential, and that caused doctors to change their prescribing approach in a very dramatic way that has killed more than 10,000 Canadians. And as Irfan was saying, I think the saddest thing about the opioid crisis is that it continues, and there's no sign, even approximately 20 years after it started. I don't see from my colleagues, I don't see from the prescribing data or from the death data any sign that is coming to an end. And I think it is important to look at that data and to have a clear definition of what is the opioid crisis, a clear target for ending it. So I would say let's bring opioid-related mortality down to pre-1999 levels. And every time someone suggests that we do something, we should measure whether or not it's working by using that as a yardstick. And by that measure, everything that we have tried so far has been a failure. And I do think it's important to look at that data because on an individual case-by-case basis, it's very difficult to understand what the problem is. And I'll just close with one little anecdote. I'm an investigating coroner, and coroners investigate all accidental deaths that happen in Ontario. So I got one of these routine calls one night. It said a woman had died, and it looks like it's another overdose. So these are routine calls now, right? Because there's so many people dying of opioid overdoses. And usually what I do when I get a call like that overnight is I call the police officer who's at the scene to get some information, to try and find out whether or not I need to get there quickly or it can wait. So I was given by the dispatch office the phone number. So I rang it, and a child picked up the phone. And I was expecting to speak to the police officer. A child picked up the phone. And I said hello, and then there was a pause because I was trying to recalibrate what I should say. And then the child said, "Is this about mom?" And so this was the child of the woman who had died. And so, the child gave the phone to the police officer. I got the information. I went to the scene, and I was asking the family about what had happened, and they had no idea how this woman could have died. She was taking her medications as she was supposed to, and one of the routine questions that we ask is whether the family had any concerns about the care that was provided, if the patient had seen a doctor recently. And the family was sort of insulted by the question, and especially the husband. They said, our doctor has been our doctor for years, cares about us. My wife went to see the doctor like every few weeks, and she took her heart medication exactly as prescribed. So I looked at the medications. She was only taking an opioid. And eventually I got information from the family doctor, and there was no heart condition. There were no heart pills. It was just the opioid that was taken. So there was some sort of miscommunication about what was going on, what sorts of pills this woman was taking. She was taking them for an unspecified reason, is the point of the story. I asked the family doctor why the patient was being prescribed opioids, and he said all of the right things about prescribing the opioid. Said, I was giving her a month's supply at a time. I saw the records, and he had done these risk assessment tools, and this woman was definitely low risk according to the tools that we use to determine someone's risk of overdose. And then, so I said, yeah, that's all fine, but my question was, why was this lady prescribed opioids? And then he said, well, she was always prescribed opioids. She was prescribed opioids from before I started taking care of her. So I said, so why is this lady prescribed opioids? Can you give me a diagnosis? Can you give me a reason? And he said no. So I actually requested the previous records where before this family doctor had started taking care of this lady. And after going through all of the records I could obtain, there actually was no reason. I had a few encounter records where she went to emergency rooms for minor things, like she had injured her shoulder once. It was unclear. She got some opioids. It was not clear to me when she started. But what was clear to me is that there was no specific reason that this lady was being prescribed opioids in the first place. And so I think that story encapsulates the problem for me. One, because the family of that lady, they don't see this as part of the opioid crisis. They weren't even sure that she was taking an opioid. And it also shows that this death, I think, could have been probably prevented if this woman was just never prescribed opioids in the first place. She would not have become dependent on these medications and wouldn't have been taking it more than 10 years later. And she probably would be alive today and with her child, whose question to me was, is this about my mom?
Okay, thanks, Nav. What I'm going to do is I'm going to invite Mel Cahan to come back up. And Mel, if you have any comments that you'd like to make based on what you've heard here in the panel, or maybe in terms of questions that were asked, and we'll just give you a couple of minutes to do that, and then it's really important for us to hear some more from all of you out there.
Thanks. An incredibly stimulating, interesting discussion. I have a few very quick comments about pharmacy and the idea of shared care. That's absolutely critical. I think that so many doctors are working in isolation. They don't have any support. They're embarrassed. They're afraid. And pharmacists are absolutely their ideal kind of candidate to work with. And it's not happening now, but it needs to happen. That kind of collaborative approach will help a lot. In terms of what Nav said, I think that was very powerful and well said. But I just want to say that your concern about the ineffectiveness of education is not completely justified. We've all put an enormous amount of work into education, and there are models which have shown to be effective, and that's when the medical regulator gets involved. And if you look at other jurisdictions in the States, when you have, for example, a dose limit of 100 milligrams of morphine equivalent or 90 milligrams, doctors comply. And that's because they're afraid and they're concerned about the regulator. And not only that, it makes it a lot easier for them to work with patients and tell them, sorry, I have to taper your dose. So I think that we need to kind of all get together. I would have to say that our medical college has been very distant. I've done a few kind of, showy things like investigating some doctors, but otherwise they have been very hands-off, and I think it's time for them to get involved and, for example, help apply the Canadian guideline and or the HQO opiate prescribing guideline to physicians and expect physicians to comply. So in terms of Benedict, I thought that concept of the kind of opiate gap is very powerful and very explanatory. The idea that patients are, or people are turning to illicit opiates in part because they can't get the opiates that they used to be able to get. And I think that what that points to is two things. First of all, physicians cannot arbitrarily stop or rapidly taper patients. It's very dangerous to do, and that's going to increase their moving to the illicit market. There has to be safe and effective ways of doing it. Secondly, as Irfan said, buprenorphine and methadone and now long-acting Cadian, which has been endorsed by the CRISM guidelines, are opiates. And they can help fill this gap because at least buprenorphine and Cadian can be prescribed by any physician, except that there are entire towns in Ontario and BC and throughout the country where there's no access to methadone or buprenorphine or Cadian or anything. And that forces patients to go to the street. In Toronto here, you can be in the emergency department with an overdose and have no access to buprenorphine treatment because there's a monopoly by these methadone clinics that has taken place. So I think there needs to be a lot more work on making sure that the opiate gap is addressed by making them widely available to all patients.
Okay. Thanks, Mel. All right, so further questions or comments from our group? Okay, I see a few hands at the very back there.
Hi, so you mentioned earlier, Dr. Prasad, about the difference between North America and the UK in terms of the need of opioids and consumption of opioids. So what's different there in terms of practice? Are there different expectations from patients around the level of pain that they'll live with? Are they doing other things before prescribing opioids? What's different about consumption, which is so different?
Yeah, well, I think just one point that I think is related to that is that, and I tried to make this earlier, opioids were never proven to be effective for the most common causes of pain, like lower back pain and osteoarthritis. So when we talk about access to other treatments like physiotherapy or other medicines, other analgesics that are not opioids, I think for the most common causes of pain, that is irrelevant to the opioid prescribing because the opioids, logically they don't actually work. They haven't been proven to work for those conditions. So regardless of what else is available, the issue is that the opioids are being prescribed inappropriately. And I think there are probably a few different reasons that in some other high-income countries, and actually middle and low-income countries, opioid prescribing is not as high as it is in Canada or the United States. One is probably the difference in the marketing campaigns that have happened there. Another is probably in the extent to which marketing campaigns actually change practice. So I don't think it's related largely to access to other treatments. And the other area that I'm working on with the student is the approval of these long-acting opioids in the late 1990s and the early 2000s.
And if you look at the number of opioid products approved in different countries, there are actually more opioid products approved in Canada and the United States versus other high-income countries. And in particular, there are more long-acting opioids approved in Canada and the United States versus countries like the United Kingdom. And so that's part of my rationale for saying we should withdraw approval for the long-acting opioids in Canada.
Thank you, Nat. Benedict, you want
just to add, we actually, it's a very interesting question, and we were sort of looking at that ourselves a few years ago, where we were sort of bewildered why this crisis was sort of exploding in North America and not really happening in most other jurisdictions. We were sort of a musing piece in addiction from a few years ago, why the opioid crisis is so much more prominent in North America than elsewhere. And as Nat said, I think there's a number of factors at play. One of them is sort of the role of industry, but also general medical culture. I mean, we overall in North America just believe a lot more that in the field of not just pain, but mental health, psychiatry, that the solution comes in the form of a pill. So it's a medical culture, and interestingly enough, there's almost a micro experiment causing going on in Canada. When you look at dispensing numbers for opioids, Quebec is always the outlier at the very bottom, like at magnitudes of up to 2- and 3-fold compared to the other provinces. So it's a combination probably of medical culture, but also in Europe, other jurisdictions, a great difference in regulation. It's often much more difficult to prescribe opioids in some countries. Only certain physicians are licensed. The prescription duration is shorter, much more controlled, more prescribing in hospital settings only. So it's a conglomerate of probably medical practice, regulatory bits and pieces, but plus also medical culture, recognizing that pain is a tricky thing to deal with, and that really the efficacy of the opioids available is extremely limited.
Is it all right if I just follow up then on that? So one of your comments was about the culture about using medication for treatment. So one of the things we haven't talked a lot about today is I completely agree that we need more access to safe opioids to treat those with opioid use disorder. But we haven't talked about the connection to addictions therapies afterwards to get to root causes to get folks off of those medications if we can over the long term. So I'm just curious about thoughts on that.
Go ahead, Beth.
Yes, I would agree completely. I don't agree that the goal is to get people off the opioid agonist therapy. People should and stay on it as long as they need to. But I think even though it's been shown that they do work, it's better to offer that than nothing at all. But certainly in conjunction with the other addiction therapies and psychosocial treatments, that goes along with it. I don't think it's an either or. You don't wait for them to get off the opioid agonist therapy to use those other therapies. They're core as well, I think.
Mel?
I just want to reinforce that point that what's happening now in methadone programs, for example, is the entire emphasis is on the drug, and that's also
I'll take it back.
also happening with using opiates for chronic pain. The fact is that many, probably most opiate users have terrible issues going on: post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, domestic violence, all sorts of things. And when they go to a methadone program, they get nothing. No counseling, nothing. They're just treated like, here's your pill or here's your drink and leave us alone. And that is, I think, contributing the fact that we are treating these terrible social and psychiatric problems simply with a medication. And it's the same with chronic pain. So I think you're right that we need to change our emphasis. The fact is, though, that support and psychotherapy is not funded very well or at all, really, by our fee structure in OHIP, but prescribing medications and seeing 60 patients a day is.
Yeah. Okay, I think.
Can we maybe just add the point that, I think we need to become a lot more differentiated and discriminate in terms of the treatment responses, because the nature of the problem has become much more differentiated in terms of the people who are presenting with opioid disorder. 20 years ago, it was mostly heroin injectors with severely chronic diseases and severe health problems. Now, we just published in Canadian Family Physicians in several LHINs in Ontario, about 20% of the people in methadone treatment are 25 years or under.
Yeah, it's terrible.
There's a lot of young people with, short-term exposure to opioids. The disorder classification has become much broader and more generous. So people qualify for opioid pharmacotherapy easily. We have a partly commercial model in Ontario where there's many clinics who are doing treatment for profit. We're sort of almost sucking into people, almost anyone they can find who qualifies for treatment. And that's sort of a problematic response in the health treatment system in itself. We need to think through this problem much more carefully. What are really the best and the optimal treatments for the different kinds of subpopulations presenting for treatment? What we really need is a much more differentiated step care model for opioid treatment than what we currently have.
Okay, I'm aware of our time, and I think we've had a pretty vibrant discussion all day. Is anybody feeling better? It really is quite a problem. So to wrap up our day, I think one of our students, or both of our students, are going to introduce Dr. David Goldblum.
First, though, we did want to provide the remaining umbrellas to our panelists.
It was sunny when I came in.
It was sunny, and I noticed everyone jealously looking at Dr. Prasad's umbrellas. I wanted to make sure that we're all equally treated here. As well as an umbrella for you, Dr. Wilson. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, Dr. Benedict Fisher, Dr. Prasad, and Dr. Beth's group. Really appreciate this. Now, as is custom at the end of all Massey Grand Rounds, we invite Dr. David Goldblum to give us a summary of what just transpired. Dr. Goldblum.
Thank you. This is summary. Well, I am in my customary, I think this is my 6th or 7th year of being the wrap-up speaker, and I always promise to be on time and on budget. That means I got an umbrella. And again, my goal today is not to give you a high-velocity summary of everything you've just heard. So I'm assuming you've all been paying attention since 1 o'clock, despite the pain associated with hard plastic and a gluteus maximus muscle. They weren't really designed to be next to each other for this period of time. But I just wanted to make a couple of comments before my usual closing just-in-time doggerel that is an expectation for these Massey Grand Rounds. William Osler said a long time ago that the desire to take medicine is perhaps the greatest feature which distinguishes man from animals. And physicians are part of that culture, a powerful part of that culture, but they're not the only part of that culture. There is the expectations among our patients and their sense of disappointment to leave an office seemingly empty-handed if they don't have a prescription. And how we resolve that conundrum and move to a better model is an ongoing challenge outside of pain, but also very much within the world of pain. So I'm only going to make 3 points today. And they are about missing voices today, about stigma, and about unintended consequences. We have had a rich selection of people who know much more about this area than I do. And because they're all colleagues and friends, I have nothing critical to say about anything that they said, just as a self-preservation instinct. But there are voices we didn't hear from today, and I think that they need to be acknowledged. We didn't hear from people who themselves are opioid users. We didn't hear from the families of people who are opioid users to understand their perspectives on this crisis. And we didn't hear really from the frontline workers in the overdose tents who are battling every day to try to save people. And I would just put it to you, those are important voices to hear from as we consider this crisis. We also didn't hear from the Sackler brothers. Now, the Sackler brothers, for those of you who are unfamiliar, are the brothers who got wealthy beyond Croesus from their ownership of Purdue Pharmaceutical. And the reason I mention the Sackler brothers is that they've been extraordinary philanthropists. There are wings of museums, there are wings of hospitals, there are medical schools that are named for the Sackler brothers. But let me tell you the one area where they have not been philanthropic. Addiction. All right? And yet it is the source, like the Rockefellers and all the other great philanthropists of ill-gotten gains. We need to be mindful of that when we walk into their museums and when we visit the wings of their hospitals, where a good chunk of this money came from. Now, we didn't hear also the perspectives of Duterte and Trump too much, although I understand Donald Trump is going to be hiring a cadre of high school teachers to shoot drug dealers. Just sort of killing two birds with one stone. We didn't hear from people in pain. And I want to emphasize that because all of us who work as health professionals see as one of our first mandates the relief of suffering and the provision of hope. And it doesn't matter what specialty you're in. The relief of suffering is a very immediate part of our mandate. And so managing pain, be it psychological pain, be it physical pain, be it the socially determined pain that people experience, is a core mandate of our jobs. And so we need to think about better ways that we can do that. Now, in terms of stigma, I just wanted to make one comment because I have institutional memory from the creation of CAMH exactly 20 years ago, and it'll be 20 years this month. And I can tell you, when we brought the two addictions facilities, the ARF and the Donwood, together with Queen Street and the Clark, the culture clash was felt at every level in the organization, from the most senior physicians to patients. And I want to say something about the patients, because there was bristling at the merger in various patient populations. And people on the mental illness side of the house said, hey, I have schizophrenia, or I have depression, I'm not a junkie, all right? And people on the addiction side said, I've got, alcohol dependence or cocaine use, I'm not crazy. And so the capacity to stigmatize the other exists at all strata and in every group in our society. And we always have to keep that in mind as we're figuring out solutions, because it colors our determinations. The third point I wanted to make was one about unintended consequences. Some of you may have seen a paper that just came out in the past few weeks from Toronto, from the School of Public Health, from a bioethicist as well as physicians who are involved in public health, about the unintended consequences of overdose education and naloxone distribution. And it is what they called task shifting. And task shifting is the idea that you load responsibility into one area to take it off another area. And I think you've heard allusion today to the need for upstream intervention, that overdose education and naloxone distribution, while necessary, are at the far end of a problem. And there may be ethical consequences no different than setting up food banks, yes. All right? Yes. And that, to me, is the ultimate in task shifting. When you have a social dependency as a society on food banks to fix a problem for which there are better solutions. But food banks then let people relax about the more pressing determinants of need for food banks. Those were the only serious comments I wanted to make. And as 4:30 is 2 minutes away, which is when we're supposed to wrap up, I will now turn to the annual Massey Grand Round Ode, hot off the presses. It is one of the commonest sayings from undergrad Marxism classes, religion's not just faith but more, the opiate of the masses. But in this Ron Tom building, understated but yet classy, discussion is the opiate of the grand rounds held at Massey. Tradition's a tradition within these pale bricked walls, from the sunlight-dappled dining hall to the darkened basement stalls. And so each year these rounds begin with greetings demi-regal from our erstwhile lobby angel and our principal Huey Siegel. And then the keyhole talks ensue, addressing why and how these drugs ensnare and how we care and what we should do now. To help us learn just how they work, there is no finer fella to teach us all the science than Dr. Irfan to tell us how the crisis started, a doc by whom I'm awed, I speak, of course, of whistleblower Dr. Nav Prasad. And as for a solution, recall Obama's "Yes, we can," and look to public health to follow Dr. Mel Kahan. As we turned our minds to fixes, perhaps not the best of nouns, we heard of action needed, a range from towns to gowns. Lynn Wilson spoke of access and the pressing need for speed. The fisher known as Benedict asked governments to heed. There's much to do before too late, at the point of care, while policies are shaped to be more use than mere hot air. Pharmacists can play a role and be a useful tool. Details were provided by CAMH's own Beth Spruill. And once again, we heard from Nav on how doctors can change scripts. Let's hope that heard by godlike ears are wise words from his lips. This doggerel is shorter than my usual, more a pup. And with your kind indulgence, I will now formally shut up.
Thank you so much. We always look forward to that, to formally end our Massey Grand Rounds. We just also wanted to thank everyone for coming and sharing this stimulating, exciting, sometimes sad and disappointing, but hopefully ultimately optimistic Massey Grand Rounds with you all today. Before leaving though, perhaps we could have Dr. Abby Angel again come up and say some final remarks.
My simple role is to congratulate the junior fellows for their organizational help, their participation, their enthusiasm, and their hope for the future for all of us. So thank you so much. And to the guests, speakers, we're absolutely delighted. A lot of this has been recorded, I believe, and will be online on our website, which is wonderful. Thank you to the photographer. A great asset. Joseph. Say, make a wave. And on that basis, on behalf of Hugh Siegel, our principal in Massey College, thank you so much for coming. I demand we'll see you next year.